Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity settles in slowly and ideas take their time stretching out, the way thoughts do when the day is winding down and the world feels a little quieter. Tonight we're stepping into something a bit older than the usual questions about time or physics or the strange habits of nature. We're drifting toward the oldest stories humans ever tried to remember, not the ones written in books, not the ones carved in stone, but the ones that lived first in voices and firesides and long, careful nights when people tried to make sense of the world, long before science had a name. Stories that feel like dreams but might, just might, be memories. The whisper of something that happened long before we learned to record anything except what our minds could hold and what our hands could shape. There's an old idea that mythology is nothing more than imagination, that ancient people invented gods and monsters and world-shaping events to explain the things they didn't understand. Storms, stars, rivers, volcanoes, seasons, love, loss, fear. Everything big, everything overwhelming, everything confusing became a character in a story, a way to manage the unknown by giving it a shape, a voice, a name. And that explanation makes sense, at least on the surface. But the more you look at these old stories, the more you notice how strangely detailed they are, how specific, how similar they can be, even in cultures that never had any contact with one another. The more you see unexpected consistency in the way different civilizations describe the world that came before them, and you start to wonder whether all those myths might be something more than fiction, something closer to history, passed down from the earliest people who witnessed events we've long forgotten, whose memories turned into legends, whose legends turned into myths, and whose myths still echo in the stories we tell today. It's an intriguing thought, that hidden inside tales of gods, giants, floods, sky people, fire from above, angry seas, and strange visitors might be fragments of something real, pieces of a civilization that lived before the ones we already know. A civilization erased by time or catastrophe or both, leaving only hints behind, carried in the memories of survivors who tried to explain what happened the only way they could. And when you think about that possibility, the question becomes not whether mythology is real in a literal way, but whether mythology is the last surviving language of the first people who tried to keep their story alive. Before we unravel that idea, I'd love to know something. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you somewhere quiet, perhaps under a blanket, maybe in a soft chair, maybe with a warm drink nearby? And what time is it where you are? Just as stories once travelled by word of mouth from person to person, idea to idea, they now reach across time zones and continents, finding listeners who arrive at the same moment in their own way. It's a strange kind of gathering, but a gentle one, and it makes these explorations feel shared in a way even the oldest storytellers might have appreciated. If you find this kind of slow, thoughtful, wandering, comforting, or interesting, or simply a nice way to settle your thoughts before sleep, I'd be grateful if you liked the video or subscribed. It helps this little corner of calm reach others who might need a moment like this. Not for answers necessarily, but for the act of exploring itself. The world is full of noise, and sometimes the quietest questions are the ones that help us drift the easiest. Tonight's question is one of those. It sits somewhere between archaeology, anthropology, psychology, and the human need to make sense of the unknown. What if ancient mythology isn't just storytelling, but a kind of time capsule? What if it preserves the memory of events, places, and people who lived before our recorded history began, not in perfect detail, not with reliable structure or strict names or recognizable borders, but in the kind of symbolic language humans use when trying to describe something too enormous, too traumatic, or too important to forget? What if myths are the memory of a world that ended, retold by the people who lived just after it, shaped and reshaped with each generation, until the details eroded but the core remained? Consider for a moment how stories behave when they are passed on through many lifetimes. They change, but they don't vanish. They stretch, but they don't fully detach from what made them start. the same way a family story told by a grandparent can become exaggerated, softened, or rearranged over time, yet still carries a trace of truth. Multiply that by thousands of years and entire cultures, and you can begin to see how a memory of an ancient event could turn into a myth that sounds fantastical today. Something like a massive flood becoming a divine punishment, a forgotten civilization becoming a race of giants, a group of skilled navigators becoming sky people who descended from the clouds, a volcanic eruption becoming the anger of a god, a meteor impact becoming fire from the heavens, and the collapse of a people becoming the fall of a golden age. There's something human about this transformation. Our minds hold on to meaning more easily than raw fact. So when the events behind a story slip away, the emotional outline remains. Something remarkable happened. Something terrifying. Something awe-inspiring. Something that demanded to be retold, even if the details were too complicated or painful or confusing to explain directly. And if the first people who told these stories lived in a world without writing or photography or scientific vocabulary, they would have described what they saw through the language they had. Their sky was filled with gods because they had no other framework to describe forces larger than themselves. Their oceans held monsters because they did not know what lived below the surface. Their mountains held spirits because they needed a reason for the power of nature. Their ancestors became giants because memory tends to enlarge what it admires. And their catastrophes became punishments because when something terrible happens without warning, humans look for meaning, even when none is obvious. All of this makes the idea that myths might contain real history more reasonable than it first appears. But to explore it properly, we have to move slowly. Myths are not literal accounts. They aren't documentaries. They aren't records in the modern sense. They are interpretations, shaped by the minds and emotions of the people who told them. But that doesn't mean they are empty. In fact, myths often align with real geological events. Flood myths exist all over the world, not because the same story was copied again and again, but because huge floods happened in many places. And when people survived those floods, they told stories about them, not with numbers or dates, but with images and characters that made sense in their world. If you lived through a devastating flood and survived, you wouldn't describe it with metrics or measurements. You'd describe it as a force so powerful it felt like a god. A sea rising with intention. Water that swallowed everything with the weight of fate. That kind of experience fixes itself in memory, and that memory takes on a shape that fits the culture keeping it alive. Now consider that on a much larger scale. Imagine an ancient civilization facing an event so intense it destroyed almost everything they built. Their temples, their cities, their writing systems, if they had any. Only the survivors remained, carrying the memory of what happened in their minds. When they explained the world to their children and their grandchildren, they didn't describe it with technical details. They described it with symbols, because symbols have a way of lasting, even when specifics do not. Over generations, the story became myth. By the time it reached us, the original event was long gone, and only the symbolic version remained. A story of gods instead of people. A story of monsters instead of natural forces. A story of battles instead of migrations. A story of creation instead of rebirth. A story of destruction instead of geological change. And if all we had left was the myth, and if we didn't know the event behind it, we'd think the entire thing was fiction. But if we look closely, patterns begin to show. Patterns that appear across continents. Patterns that shouldn't match yet somehow do. It's possible that the first civilization humans ever built is one we don't officially recognize yet. Not because it never existed, but because it was erased so thoroughly that only stories remained. Stories that were carried into the cultures that came after. Stories we now call mythology. But to understand that idea properly, we have to explore how humans remember, how cultures preserve knowledge, how oral traditions carry information across time, and how archaeology sometimes reveals evidence long after the story has already been told. Today we live under city lights, inside walls, surrounded by machines and routines that make the world feel familiar, even predictable. But the earliest humans lived in environments where almost nothing was predictable. Weather changed with little warning, animals appeared out of nowhere, the ground shook, the sky flashed, the seasons shifted, rivers rose and fell, oceans carved the land without asking permission. And in all that uncertainty, one of the few things that stayed constant was the sky. Every morning the light returned, every night the stars appeared, the moon cycled through phases in exact patterns, even if no one yet understood what those patterns meant. And because the sky was the most reliable thing they could see, they watched it carefully, they depended on it, they tried to read it, and eventually they tried to explain it. It's strange to think about now, but the first people who looked up had no language for the concepts we use to explain the sky today. They didn't have astronomy or astrophysics or even stable calendars. They had their senses, their instincts, their curiosity, and their need to understand what they were seeing. When lightning flashed, they didn't know it was electrical discharge. When the sun rose, they didn't know it was the result of a rotating planet. When an eclipse happened, they had no idea the moon was passing in front of the sun. They didn't know the Earth was round, spinning, moving through space. They didn't know stars were enormous spheres of burning gas. They didn't know the night sky was full of galaxies too far away to see. They didn't know comets were icy bodies orbiting through the solar system. At the time, all they knew was that something enormous was happening above them, and they needed a way to make sense of it. Because humans are pattern-seeking creatures, they began finding meaning in the sky. They noticed that certain stars returned at certain times of the year. They noticed that the moon's phases matched tides. They noticed that the position of the sun changed as seasons passed. And they began tying those observations to events on the ground. When the stars shifted in a certain way, animals migrated. When the sun dipped lower, cold arrived. When the moon grew full, certain plants reached peak growth. Over generations, these observations built a framework that allowed early humans to predict parts of the world. Not precisely, not scientifically, but enough to help them survive. And that helped turn the sky into more than random lights. It became a guide, a clock, a calendar, a map, a reminder, and eventually a story. This is the point where the idea of mythology begins to take shape. When a person sees a storm today, they understand it as a natural event. They understand wind and water cycles and pressure systems and temperature changes. But the earliest humans didn't think of storms in those terms. They saw something powerful enough to terrify them and fascinating enough to hold their attention. They saw something that seemed to behave with intention. It appeared suddenly. It moved with force. It caused destruction. It made sound. It made light. It struck randomly. To ancient minds, storms didn't feel like weather. They felt like beings. Not because early humans were unintelligent, but because they were trying to fit unfamiliar experiences into familiar categories. The only things they knew with that much power were living beings. So storms became sky creatures. Lightning became weapons or signals. Thunder became voices. Wind became presence. Clouds became forms. And the sky itself became a domain belonging to something greater than anything on the ground. This same instinct applied to the sun and the moon. Even today, if you sit outside and watch the sunrise without thinking about science, it's easy to understand why early humans thought of the sun as a living presence. It moves steadily across the sky. It provides warmth. It brings light. It makes food grow. It sets in the same direction each evening. It returns every morning. It behaves in a way that feels consistent, almost intentional. And because humans rely so heavily on patterns, the consistency of the sun gave it a sense of personality. It was dependable. It was powerful. It controlled the rhythm of life. So the earlier storytellers gave it a role in their cosmology, sometimes as a figure carrying a torch, sometimes as a traveller driving a chariot. sometimes as an eagle or a lion or a person or something else entirely. But the idea behind all these versions was similar. The sun was not just an object. It was involved in the world. It was part of the story. The moon sparked even more imagination. Unlike the sun, the moon changed shape, colour and position. It appeared at different times. It controlled tides. It seemed connected to birth cycles and animal behaviour. And because it wasn't constant the way the sun was, it felt more mysterious. It seemed to grow and shrink. It disappeared and returned. It followed a rhythm, yet that rhythm was more complex than the sun's. So the moon became a figure of cycles, transformation, and hidden influence. Early humans watched it carefully. Some carved its phases into bones or stones. Some used it to predict the seasons. Others tied it to the supernatural. And all these interpretations eventually formed the foundation for lunar deities, moon spirits, and myths about creation, change, and rebirth. What's interesting is that as different groups of early humans developed independently in different regions of the world, they still created remarkably similar stories about the sky. This suggests something important. The urge to explain the sky wasn't a cultural invention. It was a human instinct, something built into us, something old enough to have shaped the earliest ways we tried to interpret reality. And because the sky was both beautiful and unpredictable, it captured attention in a way nothing else could. When the first humans looked up, they weren't just being curious, they were trying to understand the structure of the world. And this brings us to the possibility that mythology might not simply be symbolic storytelling. When you look at early myths from different cultures, you begin seeing patterns that don't come from imagination alone. Humans imagine many things across history, but independent cultures didn't always imagine the same things in the same way unless something real influenced those stories. Yet flood myths appear globally, sky beings appear globally, stories of lost lands appear globally, tales of cycles of destruction and renewal appear globally, stories of an earlier age of humans appear globally. And these aren't vague similarities. They often share core elements that shouldn't match, unless something happened early in human history that affected everyone or nearly everyone. Something dramatic enough to be remembered, something that made such an impression that the memory survived even when the details faded. Imagine living thousands of years ago, long before writing existed, long before cities or agriculture or metalworking. You live in a small group with your extended family. Your world is mostly your immediate environment. Then something extraordinary happens. Maybe a large impact event. Maybe a massive volcanic eruption. Maybe a flood caused by melting ice at the end of the last ice age. Maybe an encounter with a group of people who had different technology or knowledge. Maybe something else entirely. Whatever it is, you have no modern language to describe it. You have no numbers, no diagrams, no charts, no scientific vocabulary. What you do have is storytelling. And because humans instinctively turn experience into narrative, you try to make sense of the event using characters, metaphors, and familiar elements. Over generations, your descendants retell the story. They add detail, they adjust it. They reinterpret it based on their values and environment. They preserve the emotional impact even if the factual details blur. Eventually, the story becomes myth. But even though the details change, the core remains. The memory stays, the impression persists, and thousands of years later, a researcher notices that people in completely different parts of the world tell stories with the same structure and wonders why. It's not because humans lack imagination, it's because early humans may have experienced events that shaped everyone's worldview. Events powerful enough to anchor themselves into cultural memory. When the first people looked up, they weren't just observing the sky. They were trying to understand their place in it. They were trying to understand why their world behaved the way it did. They were trying to understand the boundaries between safety and danger. They were trying to find meaning in experiences that were often frightening. And the stories they told were one of the only tools they had. Not because they were simple or naive, but because stories were a practical method of recording information. Myths were a form of data storage, and once you see myths that way, they stop being fantasy and start looking like coded history. History reshaped by memory, emotion, culture, and time, but history nonetheless. Not perfect, not complete, not literal, but containing the essence of what the earliest humans witnessed. When the world was young and humans first looked up, they didn't have the words we have now, but they had questions, they had fear, they had curiosity, they had wonder, they had experiences they needed to pass on. And those experiences became the foundation for the stories that shaped civilization. When people began forming the earliest stories about where the world came from, they weren't trying to write something symbolic or philosophical. They weren't creating literature. They were trying to explain what they saw, what they felt, and what they inherited from the generation before them. Creation stories didn't begin as myths in the sense we use the word now. They began as attempts to understand reality using the tools available at the time, and because early humans had no measurements, no geological timelines, no cosmic models, and no scientific vocabulary, they explained the world through descriptions rooted in their daily experiences. This is what makes creation stories so fascinating. They don't start from imagination alone. They start from observation filtered through the human need to understand where everything came from and why the world looks and behaves the way it does. Across cultures separated by oceans, mountains, deserts, and thousands of years of distance, you see an odd pattern. People tell creation stories with remarkably similar structures, and the question that comes up again and again is why? Why do cultures that never met describe the beginning of the world with such similar ideas? Why do so many ancient traditions describe a time before the present world, a time of darkness or emptiness or stillness, followed by a moment when something changed suddenly, the sudden appearance of light, the separation of sky and earth, the emergence of order from chaos, the rising of land from water, the arrival of beings who shape the world? These patterns appear so consistently that they start to feel less like coincidence and more like memory. Not a perfect memory, not a detailed one, but a cultural memory that survived long enough to become story. When people look at these similarities today, they often assume they come from the human imagination recurring in predictable ways. The idea is that certain story structures are simply appealing or intuitive, so different cultures invented them independently. There's some truth to that, but it doesn't explain everything. Some details in creation myths are too specific, too unusual, or too physically descriptive to be dismissed as narrative patterns. Some elements repeat in places where the cultures had no shared ancestry or communication for tens of thousands of years. Elements that resemble real geological events. Elements that match things we now understand scientifically, but that ancient people shouldn't have known in any literal sense. Elements describing environmental conditions we can now confirm through geological and climate data. When viewed from that angle, creation myths start to look less symbolic and more like ways of preserving memories of what the world looked like at the end of the last ice age, or during large-scale climate shifts, or after major natural disasters. For example, many cultures have stories about a time when the Earth was submerged in water, or when water covered nearly everything. This isn't just one region or one continent, it's widespread. If you look at traditions from the Americas, Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Oceania, Northern Europe, and many indigenous groups worldwide, you see the same theme. The world was water. The land emerged later. Sometimes it was pulled up by a creature. Sometimes it rose on its own. Sometimes a deity shaped it. Sometimes it formed from chaos. Regardless of the details, the core image remains. Water first, land second. From a scientific perspective, this sounds metaphorical. But if you examine Earth's history, there were indeed periods when melting glaciers, rising sea levels, and shifting coastlines rapidly transformed the landscape. People living through those transitions would have passed on stories of a world that had once been underwater, or had once changed dramatically due to water, and because water is such a powerful visual element, it became part of creation stories. Not as fiction, but as memory interpreted through culture. Another example is the theme of the sky and earth being once connected or fused. Many creation myths describe a time when the sky was close to the ground, or when heaven and earth were not separate. Only later, due to some event or action, were they pulled apart. At first this sounds like metaphor, but think about what early people saw in their environment. During large-scale volcanic eruptions or periods of intense atmospheric dust, the sky can look low, dark, heavy, or close. During certain climate conditions after major impacts or eruptions, the sky could appear different for extended periods. People living through such events, with no scientific understanding of atmospheric processes, might have described them using the language they had. If they saw the sky darken or thicken due to ash or dust, or if thick smoke covered the horizon, they may have passed that experience down as a time when the sky was closer. Over generations, this memory becomes a story, and the story becomes part of creation. Then there is the theme of beings arriving from above, or descending from the sky, to shape the world or teach humans. This appears across many ancient cultures, again in places separated by long distances. Today we interpret these stories in different ways depending on our interests: psychological, symbolic, extraterrestrial, or archaeological. But another possibility sometimes gets overlooked. If a more advanced group of humans existed before the civilizations we know, and if they survived a major catastrophe that wiped out most of their world, they might have travelled into other regions carrying knowledge that seemed extraordinary to the people already living there. The locals would interpret their arrival using the language of the time. They came from above, they descended, they were sky people, not literally beings from the clouds, but strangers who came from distant, unfamiliar regions, possibly from higher ground or over the horizon, bringing skills, tools, or stories from a civilization that had collapsed. And because early humans often associated anything extraordinary with the sky, the story evolved accordingly. The memory of real people arriving after a disaster could easily transform, over generations, into myths of gods descending from above. A similar pattern appears with stories of chaos before creation. In many cultures, the world begins not with order, but with confusion, darkness, or emptiness. Sometimes this chaos is described as a swirling ocean, sometimes as mist, sometimes as darkness. From a modern viewpoint, this sounds symbolic, but consider what the world looked like during major volcanic winters or after large impact events. Darkness lasting for months, ash clouds covering the sky, confusion, fear, disorientation, and long periods where the environment didn't behave normally. People living through such events would describe them in the way that made sense to them. They lived through chaos. They lived through darkness. They lived through a world that felt like it needed recreating once the sun returned, once the environment stabilized, once they could rebuild. This kind of event would imprint itself deeply on cultural memory, becoming part of a creation story that explained how order returned after disorder. One of the most curious similarities in creation myths is the presence of a first age or golden age of humanity. Stories vary in detail, but many describe an earlier time when people lived differently. Sometimes they were stronger, sometimes they lived longer, sometimes they had greater knowledge, sometimes they were closer to the gods, sometimes they understood the world in ways later people didn't. In many traditions, this earlier age ends suddenly and violently. A flood, a battle, a fire, a great fall, a collapse of the sky, or a war between powerful beings. These events destroy the first age and give rise to the world as we know it. Again, on the surface, this sounds like an invented story. But if a real earlier civilization existed, something predating the ones we usually study, then its collapse would have left a deep impression. Survivors might have described the previous age as a time when people were more capable, or lived differently, because they used tools or practices that were later forgotten. Over generations, memory becomes myth. The first age becomes more dramatic than reality, but it still carries a trace of the idea that something existed before the known world. What makes all this so compelling is that creation stories not only explain the origin of the world, but also hint at cycles. Many cultures describe worlds being created, destroyed, and created again. They describe previous ages that ended and new ones that began. They describe humanity starting over, sometimes more than once. In a symbolic sense, this reflects natural cycles, seasons, birth and death, growth and decay. But in a historical sense, it might reflect something else. Humans have lived through multiple environmental resets. Sea levels have risen dramatically. Ice has advanced and retreated. Volcanic eruptions have reshaped landscapes. Meteor impacts have triggered regional collapses. Civilizations have risen and fallen. In some periods, the world truly did undergo large-scale transformation. If early humans lived through these changes, their memories of them would likely merge into stories about the destruction and rebirth of the world. Not precise, not chronological, but emotionally accurate versions of what they experienced. When creation myths talk about the world being formed from pieces, or from remnants, or from chaos, or from the body of a creature, they may be describing something much simpler. The earth was reshaped, land moved, rivers changed course, coastlines shifted. The environment people relied on was destroyed or altered, and they had to rebuild their understanding of the world. Explaining this through story made it easier to pass the memory down without losing its core meaning. Even if the exact geological processes weren't understood, the experience of living through them was powerful enough to become the foundation for a story about creation. There's also something important about how creation myths handle knowledge. In many of these stories, knowledge isn't discovered, it's given. Fire, agriculture, tools, language, writing, medicine, navigation. These elements often appear in stories as gifts from gods, spirits, or celestial beings. But from an anthropological perspective, these could reflect the memory of older groups teaching younger ones. If a more advanced culture collapsed and small groups of survivors moved into simpler communities, sharing skills that seemed extraordinary, those communities would remember the arrival of knowledge as something external. It came from someone else, someone unusual, someone who knew things they didn't. And over generations, memories of those teachers might transform into myths of powerful beings who gave humanity knowledge at the beginning of the world. When you examine creation stories with this possibility in mind, they become something different. They become frameworks for describing events that were too large or too complex for early humans to articulate directly. They become evidence of shared experiences that echo across continents. They become records of human attempts to understand not only how the world came to be, but how civilizations emerge, collapse, and transform. And while details vary, the underlying familiarity of these stories suggests that ancient people may have been trying to preserve memories of a world that changed dramatically around them, a world that forced them to start over, a world that left traces in their traditions long after the physical evidence had eroded or disappeared. When people told these stories, they weren't thinking about archaeology or timelines or accuracy. They were thinking about meaning. They were thinking about survival. They were thinking about what their ancestors taught them and what their descendants needed to know. They were trying to make sense of moments that felt larger than life. They were trying to remember something that mattered. And even though the stories changed over time, the familiarity remained. Patterns echo across continents, not because people copied each other, but because they were all trying to explain the same world. A world shaped by forces that still exist, and by events that may have happened when the earliest humans were watching the sky and trying to understand what kind of world they had inherited. These stories, despite being altered and embellished over thousands of years, might still carry the outline of what the earliest people lived through. When people talk about lost civilizations, the mind usually jumps to places like Atlantis or Lemuria, or other names passed around in conversations that mix imagination with archaeology. But beneath the large dramatic stories are much quieter ones. Stories about real people, real settlements, real cultures that rose long before recorded history and disappeared so completely that only hints of them remain. These hints show up in archaeology, geology, linguistics, and oral traditions. But some of the strongest echoes appear in mythology, not because myths describe these civilizations directly, but because the stories that survived carry fragments of memories that no longer have physical evidence to support them. When you start looking for these echoes, they appear more often than expected, not in a way that tells a complete story, but in a way that suggests a much older human past than what we usually acknowledge. The earliest civilizations we recognize officially, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, did not appear suddenly from nothing. They emerge with knowledge already in place. Complex social structures, agriculture, astronomy, engineering, knowledge of tides and seasons, understanding of tools, a sense of measurement, systems of symbols or early writing. And these skills seem to appear in ways that don't entirely match the slow, gradual development we expect. It doesn't mean something extraordinary happened. It doesn't mean there was a lost global civilization with advanced technology. But it does raise the question of what came before. If humans have existed for hundreds of thousands of years, why do our earliest recognized civilizations start so late in the timeline? What happened during the enormous stretch of time before cities formed? And why does so much mythology describe events or knowledge from an earlier world? Some researchers argue that humans forgot much more than they discovered. That long before agriculture, people developed complex ways of living adapted to their environment, but left few traces because their materials were organic, their tools small, and their settlements vulnerable to climate changes. Others suggest that societies rose and fell multiple times before the ones we study today, especially during periods when sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the last ice age. More than 10 million square kilometres of land were swallowed by the oceans as ice melted. Coastlines we know today did not exist. Entire regions that once supported human life disappeared underwater. If a civilization lived along those coastlines, a reasonable assumption given how people tend to settle near water, its ruins would now lie hundreds of feet below the surface. We haven't explored those areas enough to know what remains. Most of the ocean floor is still unmapped in detail, so when myths describe lands disappearing into the sea or cities swallowed by water, they might be referencing events that happened in real time to cultures that lived on coastlines that no longer exist. One example is the repeated presence of flood stories. They appear in hundreds of cultures. While the details differ, some involve a great boat, some involve a raft, some involve survivors climbing mountains, some involve divine warnings, the core is similar. The world was once destroyed or reset by water, and only a small number of people survived to rebuild. This could be symbolic, but it could also reflect real events. At the end of the last ice age, massive glacial lakes burst their boundaries. Entire regions flooded in ways far beyond seasonal normalcy. Sea levels rose so quickly that within a few generations, coastlines moved dramatically. People living at the time would have experienced these changes as overwhelming natural disasters. Their descendants would have carried the memory of those events long after the physical evidence disappeared. Another echo shows up in stories of the first people. Many cultures describe an earlier race or group that lived before the present world. Sometimes they were giants, sometimes they were very small, sometimes they had special knowledge, sometimes they lived in harmony with the world, sometimes they were wiped out. The specifics shift, but the pattern remains. A sense of something that came before and left no physical trace except its stories. In some traditions, the first people lived in caves or beneath the earth. In others, they lived on mountains or islands that no longer exist. In some, they built structures too large for later generations to replicate. Archaeology occasionally uncovers remains or artifacts that feel older than expected, or appear more complex than the surrounding culture. These finds rarely rewrite history on their own, but they raise questions about whether earlier societies had levels of organisation or skill that didn't survive long enough to become recognised civilizations. A good example is the discovery of sites far older than expected for their level of complexity. Places with sophisticated architecture, careful alignments, carvings, or large-scale construction appearing thousands of years before cities were thought to exist. When archaeologists uncover a site like this, the assumption is often that the people who built it must have been more socially organised than we previously thought. And that's true. But if people were building complex structures earlier than expected, then our understanding of when civilization began becomes less stable. We tend to imagine civilization as a linear progression, first hunting and gathering, then farming, then settlements, then cities. But the discoveries of highly organised ancient sites suggest that people experimented with various forms of civilization long before the classical timeline begins. This is where mythology becomes relevant. The stories from many cultures describe earlier ages where people lived in communities or societies with specific roles or specialised knowledge. These ages end suddenly, often through disaster. Then new ages begin, where humans have to relearn or rediscover what was lost. When people today hear these stories, they often focus on the narrative's supernatural elements. But if early societies did form and collapse repeatedly, myths could simply be describing those cycles in the language available at the time. A culture that saw its settlements destroyed by rising water or by climate changes might later describe that destruction as a great flood or as the end of a previous age. A culture that inherited ruins from unknown builders might describe those builders as giants or gods because their knowledge was beyond what current generations understood. Another echo of lost civilizations appears in myths about land bridges, long migrations and journeys across regions that no longer exist. Some cultures describe walking across areas that are now underwater. Some describe lands connected that are now separate. Some describe mountains or valleys that no longer exist. Because early humans lived through the end of the last ice age, their oral traditions naturally carried memories of a changing landscape. If a culture once travelled across land now submerged beneath oceans, their descendants might preserve those journeys as legends. Over thousands of years, the details warp, and the explanation shifts from geography to narrative. But the memory of the journey remains. This is why certain myths describe long walks to places impossible today. The land has changed, but the stories outlasted it. Another interesting pattern appears in myths that describe how people learn to build, farm, navigate, or shape materials. Many cultures present these skills as gifts or teachings from beings who arrived after a disaster or at the beginning of a new age. The beings are often described as wise, tall, radiant, knowledgeable, or distinct in some other way. Some represent real elders or groups of migrants arriving from elsewhere. Others could represent survivors of an earlier culture sharing their knowledge with populations who didn't have those skills yet. Over time, these figures evolved into gods or heroes. Their real identities blurred as stories drifted through generations. But if an earlier civilization collapsed, the few people who survived might have carried essential knowledge with them, causing later cultures to view them as extraordinary. This matches a familiar pattern in anthropology. When groups with different skill levels interact, the more advanced group often becomes mythologized by the less advanced one. Their knowledge seems miraculous, their tools seem magical, their behavior seems unusual. This happens even today in situations where isolated groups first encounter outsiders. It's not surprising that the same dynamic occurred thousands of years ago when remnants of older societies crossed paths with developing ones. Myths preserve these encounters, not as literal records, but as stories that encode the memory of people who seemed different enough to be remembered long after they were gone. And then there are myths describing structures, cities, or monuments from earlier times, tales of ruins in the jungle, temples built before known cultures existed, stone circles or mounds placed by mysterious ancestors, legends of underground cities, stories about corridors under mountains. These appear in countless traditions. Archaeology does occasionally confirm some of these stories, uncovering sites exactly where myths said they would be. But many remain unverified and may never be found because natural forces erase evidence far faster than most people realise. Wood rots quickly, clay washes away, brick dissolves, stone collapses. Only a tiny fraction of ancient human activity leaves permanent traces, and of that tiny fraction, only a small part is accessible. Much of it lies beneath jungles, deserts, or oceans. So when myths describe cities or cultures that no longer exist, the absence of physical evidence is not surprising. Most ancient settlements didn't survive. What survived best were stories. Some scholars argue that mythology is not a record of lost civilizations, but simply a record of human imagination. But imagination alone doesn't explain why so many myths describe changes in climate, rising waters, falling skies, long migrations, beings arriving after disasters, knowledge being given by outsiders, or worlds ending suddenly. Imagination doesn't typically produce the same patterns independently across so many cultures unless something real influenced those patterns. Even if the stories are not literally true, they likely carry memories of events that shaped early human experience. And if those events shaped everyone, then it's not surprising that the stories echo each other. Sometimes the echoes appear in small details. A story in one region describing a type of disaster matches geological data from that region. A story in another region describes something similar happening at almost the same period. These small details often get overlooked because myths are usually studied symbolically, not scientifically. But when examined carefully, they form a network of memories pointing to a world that changed rapidly at multiple points in early human history. A world that forced people to adapt quickly. A world where entire populations relocated, mingled, or disappeared. A world where societies may have formed, developed unique knowledge, and vanished before they could establish long-lasting records. The stories that survived from these groups didn't carry dates or maps or explicit explanations. They carried impressions of what mattered, what was dangerous, what was remarkable, what was worth passing down. These impressions accumulated over generations. They expanded. They merged with other stories. They absorbed new experiences, and over thousands of years they became mythology. But beneath the narrative choices, beneath the symbolic figures, beneath the supernatural descriptions, the memory of real events remains visible. Not clear enough to reconstruct a full history, not precise enough to identify specific civilizations, but enough to suggest that the world humans inhabited long before written history was more complex than we assume. Enough to suggest that the rise and fall of societies happened more than once. Enough to suggest that the people who lived through those changes tried to preserve what they saw in the only way they could. When something dramatic happened in the environment, whether it was a disaster or a slow shift in climate or a sudden change in the landscape, people absorbed that experience into their memory. That memory eventually became a story, and as the generations passed, the story became part of the culture's mythology. These stories weren't created to entertain, they were created to explain. And when the event was bigger than anything people had ever seen before, the story often became larger than life because that was the only language available to describe something so overwhelming. This is one of the most important overlooked aspects of mythology. Many myths don't just describe imaginary events or symbolic lessons. They describe moments when the world changed at a scale that frightened entire populations. When a natural disaster struck, people had no way to understand what caused it. They couldn't track pressure systems or measure seismic activity or identify the warning signs of eruptions. They couldn't watch satellite images or compare geological layers. Everything they knew came from direct experience, and when a disaster arrived unexpectedly, the shock of it left a lasting impression. That impression had to be preserved somehow, and storytelling became the tool that allowed people to pass the memory down long after the event itself faded from the landscape. This is why so many myths describe floods, fires, earthquakes, falling skies, long winters, global darkness, and other large-scale disruptions. It's not because ancient people were obsessed with destruction, it's because they lived through events that were difficult to comprehend. When a region experienced a catastrophe, that moment forced itself into the culture's memory. People who survived would have talked about it for the rest of their lives. Their children would grow up hearing the story, their grandchildren would hear it too, and after many generations the memory would transform into a myth. Not because anyone intended to change it, but because memory drifts naturally when it is passed verbally, especially over long time scales. One pattern that appears globally is the story of the Great Flood. Nearly every continent has a version of this event. Rising waters destroyed the world. Only a few people survived. They rebuilt afterward. The details vary, but the structure is consistent. What's interesting is that these stories often mention waters rising not slowly over centuries, but suddenly or violently. From a modern perspective, people usually think of slow, gradual sea level rise. But during certain periods, water levels changed much faster than expected. When glacial lakes broke their boundaries, whole regions were submerged in a short time. When ice sheets collapsed, meltwater entered the oceans rapidly, raising sea levels across coastlines. People living during these periods would have seen their homes swallowed by water in ways that made no sense to them. They would have remembered it vividly. They would have passed that memory down. And because the event was so enormous, the story would eventually take on a scale that matched how the experience felt. It wasn't a local flood, it felt like the world had ended. Another type of cataclysm preserved in mythology comes from large volcanic eruptions. When a volcano erupts at a massive scale, the effects can last for years. Darkness can cover entire regions, temperatures can drop, crops fail, animals migrate or die, rivers change course, people flee their homes. These events leave emotional scars that can be passed down long after the environment recovers. Many cultures have myths describing a period when the sun disappeared, or when the sky turned dark, or when ash fell like snow. These descriptions often align closely with what we now understand about volcanic winters. What seems like a supernatural event in a myth is sometimes a very accurate recollection of an eruption's aftermath. The strange thing is how consistent these descriptions are across different regions. People describe the darkness as thick. They describe the cold as sudden. They describe the fear as overwhelming. They describe the sky behaving in ways they'd never seen before. These are not metaphorical accounts. They sound like first-hand reactions to catastrophic environmental change. Another common element in myths is the idea of fire from the sky. This appears in so many cultures that it raises questions about what events inspired these stories. Some describe fire streaking across the heavens. Some describe the ground shaking after the skyfire landed. Some describe entire regions burning. Some describe the sun becoming unbearable. Others describe nights when the sky glowed. Today we understand that meteor impacts and airbursts have occurred multiple times in human history. The Tunguska event in 1908 flattened thousands of square kilometers of forest. An airburst over the Middle East several thousand years ago is believed to have destroyed entire settlements. These events produce shock waves, heat, bright light, and sound capable of terrifying anyone who sees them. If early humans witnessed such a phenomenon, they would remember it for generations. And without scientific language, they would describe what they saw using the closest comparisons available. Fire in the sky, a star falling, a weapon from the heavens, the anger of a celestial being. The details would blur over time, but the memory would remain. Stories of the sky falling or the heavens collapsing also appear surprisingly often. At first, this might sound purely symbolic, but consider how the sky looks during major environmental changes. After impacts, wildfires, volcanic eruptions, or even massive storms, the sky can appear low, distorted, or filled with smoke. The horizon can change colour, light can scatter differently, dusk can turn noon into twilight. People who lived through these events experienced the environment in ways that would feel alien to us today. When the sky changed suddenly, people had no scientific framework to understand why. They would have described the event in the simplest terms possible. The sky fell, the sky broke, the heavens bent. Over time, the memory would transform into a story describing a cosmic struggle or a world-destroying event. One of the most intriguing cataclysmic memories preserved in mythology relates to long winters or cold periods. Many cultures describe a time when the sun weakened or disappeared, when cold overtook the land, when people struggled to survive, and when whole groups migrated. These stories appear in both northern and equatorial regions. In some traditions, winter came suddenly, without warning. In others, it lasted many years. Today we know that large volcanic eruptions, shifts in ocean currents, and other climate events can produce prolonged cooling. For early humans, who relied on seasonal patterns for survival, such a shift would have been devastating. Food sources would disappear, plants would fail to grow, animals would migrate unpredictably. People would have to travel long distances to find new habitats. These migrations and the events that triggered them became powerful memories, eventually forming the basis for myths about long winters or ice ages. Some myths describe a time when the world was covered in darkness not because of winter, but because of smoke, ash, or dust. These stories often align with what we now recognise as the aftermath of eruptions or impacts. People describe difficulty breathing, rivers becoming toxic, and animals fleeing the region. They describe the sun being obscured. They describe stars becoming impossible to see. They describe the environment behaving in unfamiliar ways. These details are not symbolic. They match real symptoms of atmospheric disruption. But because early humans lacked a language for explaining such phenomena, the memory became encoded in mythology. Another set of myths describes sudden warming, melting, or the rising of waters due to the loss of ice. These stories often come from cultures living near coastlines or rivers that changed dramatically during glacial melt periods. At the end of the last ice age, temperatures rose significantly in certain regions. Ice sheets collapsed. Sea levels rose rapidly. Ecosystems changed. People living during this period might have interpreted the warming as a dramatic shift in the world. They might have described it through stories of fire spirits, sun gods, or cosmic renewal. The physical event was real. The story gave it meaning. Over time, the memory of the warming became part of cultural mythology. Another interesting pattern appears in myths that describe entire continents or islands sinking. People often assume these stories are purely fantastical. But when sea levels rise or when coastlines collapse due to earthquakes or erosion, entire land masses can become submerged. Islands can disappear. Coastal cities can vanish underwater. If this happened to early humans living in regions that are now submerged, their descendants would preserve the event as a dramatic transformation of the world. Because the land didn't simply erode slowly, it vanished, it was swallowed. And in the language of early storytelling, this became a story of a land sinking into the sea, not metaphorically but literally, based on what they experienced. One of the strongest signs that myths preserve memories of real cataclysms is the presence of date-like descriptions. Many stories say things like, "There was a time before this age," or "The world has been destroyed multiple times," or "We are the people of the fourth world," or "The old world was lost." These descriptions show an awareness that the present world emerged from earlier cycles of destruction and renewal. This isn't purely symbolic. It matches the reality of environmental cycles humans live through. People saw the ice ages end. They saw waters rise, they saw forests burn, they saw climates shift, they saw animals go extinct. To them, these moments felt like world endings, and they preserved them as such. Some myths describe survivors travelling long distances after a cataclysm. They describe families or groups leaving behind destroyed homelands searching for new territory. Many mention crossing mountains, deserts, or long stretches of water. These accounts strongly resemble real migrations triggered by environmental collapse. Modern genetics confirms that human populations migrated extensively during periods of climate change. The stories of long journeys reflect the emotional memory of these migrations. People didn't just move. They moved because something forced them to. Something big enough to make entire regions uninhabitable. Something memorable enough to be told long after the migration ended. Another recurring feature is the presence of guardians, heroes, or divine figures who help people survive a disaster. While these figures are mythologized, they could represent real individuals who played crucial roles during crises. Leaders who guided migrations, herbalists who found new food sources, builders who constructed shelters, elders who interpreted environmental signs. Over time, their contributions became extraordinary in the cultural memory. They became larger than life. They became mythological. But beneath the exaggeration, there may have been real people whose actions helped their community survive an event that would otherwise have wiped them out. In some traditions, myths describe people hiding underground or in caves during cataclysms. This aligns with archaeological findings showing that caves often served as shelters during extreme climate events. When the surface environment became dangerous due to cold, heat, ash, or storms, caves offered stability. People who survived in caves would pass down the memory of hiding from the outside world. Over time, this became a story about surviving a cosmic event or a divine punishment. The memory was real. The story gave it shape. One of the most striking features in myths about cataclysms is the sequence of events. Many stories describe a series of environmental transformations: darkness, cold, flooding, fire, famine, migration, renewal. These are not random sequences. They match the known order of events in volcanic winters, impact events, and ice age transitions. The accuracy of this sequence across multiple cultures suggests that the stories preserve something more than imagination. They preserve observations passed down through oral tradition. Not perfectly, but consistently enough to indicate a real historical basis. Another reason myths preserve cataclysms is the emotional weight of these events. People remember what frightens them. Families pass down stories about danger so that future generations can avoid similar situations. When a disaster is severe enough, its memory becomes part of the culture's identity. People define themselves as survivors. They explain their origins through the event. They frame their traditions around what the catastrophe taught their ancestors. Mythology becomes a record not only of the event but of the lessons it left behind. This emotional memory is powerful. It can survive for thousands of years. Even when the physical traces of the catastrophe disappear, the memory remains. This is why myths can preserve events far older than most written histories. Written records decay, structures collapse, landscapes change, but oral traditions persist as long as a community survives. And because early humans lived in small groups, their stories were personal. They didn't want the memory to be forgotten. They needed the next generation to understand what their ancestors had lived through. As generations pass, myths drift further from the original event. Details change, names shift, explanations evolve, but the core memory remains: a great flood, a long winter, fire from the sky, a period of darkness, a world reshaped. These core memories are the fingerprints of real cataclysms. They appear in too many unrelated cultures to be coincidence. Sometimes the memories become elaborate. They turn into stories of battles between gods, wars in the heavens, creatures swallowing the sun, or supernatural forces reshaping the earth. These elaborations are not fabrications, they are interpretations. People didn't understand plate tectonics or atmospheric chemistry. They didn't understand the mechanics of glacial melt. They didn't understand meteors. So they explained these events through the only lens they had: the behaviours and intentions of beings with power. The emotional memory is accurate. The interpretation fits the worldview of the time. This is why mythology is so valuable for understanding ancient cataclysms. Myths show how early humans interpreted real events. They are windows into how the world looked to people who lived before agriculture, before cities, before written language. They show what mattered to people long before history began. And they suggest that humans witnessed many more dramatic environmental events than our archaeological record currently reflects. When people first began comparing myths from different parts of the world, they assumed the similarities were coincidence or the result of simple human imagination. The idea was that certain stories were universal because humans everywhere think in similar ways or try to answer the same basic questions. That explanation works for some themes, but it doesn't explain everything. When you look closely at myths from cultures separated by oceans and by tens of thousands of years of distance, you begin noticing details that go far beyond general themes. These details form patterns too unusual to ignore. They appear in societies that had no trade routes, no shared ancestors for tens of thousands of years, no written language, and no way of communicating. Yet they tell stories that mirror each other with surprising precision. Some of these parallels are broad, others are specific enough that you have to stop and wonder why the details match so closely. And the more carefully you examine these stories, the more it seems that the cultures describing them are all remembering something. Not the exact same event, but something related. Something that affected the earliest groups of people before migration, climate changes, or oceans separated entire populations. Something that happened early enough to leave a deep impression. Something memorable enough that people carried the memory even as they moved into new lands, crossed vast regions, adapted to new environments, and built new cultures. One of the clearest examples is the story of a world destroyed by water. This appears everywhere, not just in one or two places, not just in a few regions known for floods. It appears in South America, North America, Africa, Australia, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Northern Europe, and among island cultures scattered across remote oceanic regions. In many cases, these cultures were isolated for thousands of years. Their languages diverged, their traditions changed. But the memory of a flood remained. The details vary, but the core of the story is consistent. Water rose. The world was changed. Only a few people survived. They rebuilt afterward. People usually assume this is symbolic of renewal or spiritual cleansing. But when the story appears in cultures separated by entire oceans, it suggests something else. It suggests that the earliest humans who spread across the world carried a memory of large-scale flooding. Not necessarily one single global event, but a period when the world's coastlines were transformed by rising sea levels. When the Ice Age ended, water levels rose dramatically. Entire land bridges disappeared. Islands formed. Coastlines shifted. People living during those changes would have told stories about land vanishing and waters rising. These memories became part of their cultural identity. When different groups migrated across continents, they carried the memory with them, even if the details changed. Another shared story appears in myths about a time when the sky behaved differently. Many cultures describe a period when the sun did not move the way it does now, or when daylight lasted far longer or far shorter than usual, or when darkness stretched across days or months. These stories exist far beyond polar regions where such variations naturally occur. They appear in equatorial cultures that would never experience extended daylight or night. The question becomes why these stories exist there. One explanation is that early humans lived through periods when volcanic ash or dust from impact events altered the sky. For months or years, the sun might have appeared distorted. Days might have felt dimmer. Nights might have felt brighter due to atmospheric scattering. These experiences could easily evolve into myths about the sun changing its path or failing to rise. When cultures migrated away from the regions where these events happened, they carried the stories with them. The physical explanation was lost, but the memory remained. Another pattern shows up in stories of beings who taught early humans essential skills. These beings appear globally in stories from cultures that never shared contact. Some describe them as tall, others describe them as radiant or wise, some describe them as visitors from far away, others describe them as people who arrived after a disaster. These figures teach agriculture, fire use, tool-making, medicine, weaving, navigation, and other practical skills. The consistency of this pattern suggests that many cultures remember receiving knowledge from outsiders, not from supernatural beings, but from groups who migrated after surviving earlier collapses or living in regions where knowledge developed earlier. When those groups met communities that lacked those skills, the exchange would have felt profound. The memory of that meeting became mythologized. Over time, it transformed into the story of divine teachers or culture bringers. Another common theme is the memory of an earlier age when people lived differently. Many cultures describe a time before the present world. Sometimes people were said to be stronger, sometimes they lived longer lives, sometimes they had abilities that later generations lacked. Sometimes they built structures that the current people couldn't replicate. These stories sound fantastical, but they might be describing an earlier culture with practices or technologies that were lost after a disaster. Oral traditions often exaggerate details to preserve the emotional significance. If people inherited ruins from an unknown earlier group, they might assume the builders were giants. If people inherited tools they no longer knew how to create, they might assume the creators had extraordinary abilities. The symbolic layers build over generations, but the underlying memory might be a simple one. Something existed before, and its knowledge did not survive intact. Another interesting parallel appears in myths that describe a period when the earth was reshaped. Many cultures tell stories of mountains rising suddenly, of valleys opening, of rivers changing course, or of entire regions sinking. At first, these stories seem imaginative, but geology shows that the Earth's surface has changed dramatically in recent times relative to human history. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and glacial shifts reshape landscapes. People living through those transformations might describe them in emotional or visual terms rather than technical ones. Over time, these descriptions become myths. What stands out is how many of these myths describe similar sequences: shaking, splitting, rising, falling, flooding. These sequences match the real order of events in tectonic activity or post-glacial rebound. The similarities are unlikely to be coincidence. They reflect shared experiences. Another fascinating overlap appears in stories about great fires that ended earlier worlds. Many cultures describe fire sweeping across land, skies filled with flame, or heat that destroyed entire regions. These stories often align with known wildfire cycles, volcanic eruptions, or impact events that caused intense heat. These events leave lasting impressions not just on the landscape but on the cultural imagination. People who survive severe fires often describe the event as the world burning. Over generations, the literal memory becomes mythologized. The emotional weight remains, and the story travels through time. Stories about long journeys across dangerous landscapes also appear globally. Many myths describe people traveling great distances after a disaster, crossing deserts, mountains, or plains. They describe losing their original homeland, searching for a new one, and eventually settling in a place where a new culture emerges. These stories match patterns in human migration, especially during periods of climate change. When food sources shifted or environments became uninhabitable, people moved. These migrations were not small or simple. They were long, difficult, and emotionally significant. The memory of these migrations became part of cultural mythology. Even after thousands of years, the story of the journey remained. The details might change, but the structure stayed the same. What's especially striking is how cultures that never met share highly specific mythological structures. For example, Some groups describe the world emerging from water, others describe land rising upward, others describe the sun being placed in the sky by a figure or event, others describe a cosmic egg, a split world, or a reconstructed Earth. These aren't just symbolic explanations, they resemble attempts to describe real environmental transitions using metaphor. People living through the end of the last ice age saw land appear where ice once stood. They saw valleys open. They saw coastlines change shape. They saw hills form from melting glaciers. Without scientific language, they described what they saw through narrative. These descriptions travelled through generations and eventually became creation stories. The consistency across cultures suggests they came from real observations of a changing world. Another overlapping pattern involves myths describing a time when animals behaved differently, or when humans could interact with them more directly. In some stories, humans and animals communicated. In others, animals were much larger or much more influential. These myths appear across continents. At first they sound symbolic, but during the Pleistocene the world was full of megafauna, large animals that have since gone extinct. Early humans interacted with these creatures regularly. For people living today, the idea of encountering massive mammals seems fantastical. But for early humans, it was normal. When later generations found bones or rock art depicting these animals, the memory evolved into stories about a time when animals were larger or more powerful. These stories became part of mythology, even in cultures far removed from the original encounters. Another global similarity is the presence of trickster figures who challenge order and bring change. These figures appear in Africa, the Americas, Oceania, and Asia. Their traits vary, but their role is consistent. They disrupt stability. They cause transitions. They change the world unintentionally. These figures represent forces that reshape societies. Sometimes they represent natural forces. Sometimes they represent cultural changes. Sometimes they represent individuals whose actions cause significant shifts. Their stories preserve memories of pivotal moments that altered the course of a culture's development. One of the most curious overlaps involves myths about a distant homeland or an earlier place of origin. Many cultures describe coming from a land that no longer exists or from a region far away. These myths are often framed in symbolic terms, but they may reflect real ancient migrations. Genetic studies show that human populations moved across continents many times. These migrations were often triggered by climate events. The memory of the original homeland might have been passed down for generations. Even when the physical location was forgotten or submerged or abandoned, the story of the place remained. Another shared mythic element appears in descriptions of beings who lived underground or in hidden worlds. These beings are not always supernatural. In some stories, they are described as previous people who survived disasters by seeking shelter. In others, they are described as ancestors who lived in enclosed spaces. This aligns with archaeological evidence showing that caves and underground shelters were essential during harsh climate periods. People sheltered in these places for months or years. The memory of living underground during crises could easily evolve into stories about hidden people or earlier groups who lived out of sight. Many myths also describe cycles of destruction and renewal. The world ends, a new world begins. Sometimes this happens multiple times. This pattern is too consistent to dismiss. It matches real cycles of climate and environmental change that force people to rebuild repeatedly. These cycles were traumatic. They shaped entire populations. The memory of them became part of mythology. Another notable similarity appears in stories of cosmic battles or conflicts in the sky. These battles often involve forces of light and darkness, heat and cold, or order and chaos. They may reflect real environmental events like auroras, meteor showers, volcanic eruptions, or atmospheric changes. Early humans seeing bright streaks in the sky or sudden celestial phenomena would have interpreted them as battles. These images persisted in myth long after the events ended. What ties all these parallels together is not a single event, but a shared human experience of living through a world that was far more unstable than ours. The earliest humans lived through ice ages, volcanic winters, droughts, fires, and floods. They migrated across continents. They adapted to changing environments. They lost homelands. They discovered new ones. They encountered unfamiliar groups. They survived crises that would define their descendants. The memory of these experiences became mythology. People didn't create myths by sitting down and inventing stories. Myths accumulated slowly over thousands of years. They evolved as memories travelled through generations. They changed as people moved across landscapes. They adapted to new languages and new cultures. But beneath the changes, the original experiences remained visible. Not clearly, not precisely, but consistently enough that when you compare myths from distant cultures, you can see the outlines of the same memories. When people study ancient mythology, they often focus on the supernatural elements first. The gods who throw lightning, the spirits who control storms, the beings who shape mountains, the figures who travel between worlds. But once the supernatural surface is stripped away and you read the stories carefully, something becomes clear. These gods don't behave like distant cosmic entities. They behave like people. They argue. They love. They get jealous. They form alliances. They make mistakes. They help. They hurt. They teach. They punish. They wander. They return. And in many cases, they interact with humans in ways that resemble encounters between groups with different levels of knowledge or technology, rather than interactions between mortals and divine beings. This pattern appears in cultures all over the world, which raises an important question. Why do gods across so many unrelated myths behave so similarly to human beings? One explanation is that people anthropomorphize everything. They give human traits to forces they don't understand. That idea is appealing because it simplifies mythology, and it helps explain why storms or earthquakes or seasons were turned into characters. But it doesn't fully explain why some myths describe their gods with surprising detail. Details about height, appearance, behaviour, diet, tools, clothing, knowledge, and even interpersonal conflicts. These are not descriptions of natural forces. They are descriptions of people who are remembered so vividly that their stories survived long after they were gone. If you gather myths from various parts of the world and compare them, you start to notice that these divine or semi-divine figures often have very specific human qualities. They speak languages, they use tools, they travel in groups, they teach skills, they establish rules, they negotiate, they form relationships, they experience emotions that are entirely human in nature. They aren't distant abstract forces. They are closer to cultural heroes, leaders, or teachers whose memory grew larger over time. The idea that myths exaggerate real people isn't new. Many cultures openly say that their gods were once ancestors or early leaders. These figures became elevated in memory because of what they achieved. Over generations, the stories changed, making them seem more powerful or supernatural than they originally were. But the striking part is that even in cultures that insist their gods were always divine, the narratives still describe them performing ordinary human-like actions. They build, they farm, they create laws, they travel, they teach crafts, they intervene directly in community life. This raises another possibility. What if the earliest myths remember encounters between ordinary people and groups who were different in some way? Not necessarily in appearance, though some stories suggest that, but in knowledge, experience, or cultural development. If a small group of survivors from an older culture encountered communities that had not yet developed the same skills, their behaviour could easily have appeared extraordinary. The community might remember these people as beings with abilities beyond human limitations. Over time, the memory of these encounters would become mythological. This idea becomes even more intriguing when you look at the types of knowledge these mythic figures possessed. In many stories, the gods teach humans how to farm, store food, build shelters, navigate, use fire more effectively, note the movement of stars, shape tools, or make pottery. These are not supernatural activities. These are signs of cultural transfer. When one group carries knowledge gained over generations and shares it with another that lacks those techniques, the exchange feels transformative. The receiving group might frame the encounter as divine guidance, not because they misunderstood the visitors, but because they valued the knowledge so deeply that the teachers became unforgettable. One example appears in Mesoamerican myths. The figure known as Quetzalcoatl is described as a god, but his behaviour is entirely human. He teaches people agriculture, metallurgy, calendar making, and peaceful governance. He forbids harmful practices. He travels. He debates. He struggles. He leaves. These traits resemble those of a skilled leader or teacher rather than an abstract deity. Over generations, the memory of the person would have expanded, becoming part of the culture's mythological framework. A similar figure appears in Sumerian tradition. Enki, often described as a god of knowledge, behaves in ways that resemble a wise ancestor or mentor. He gives advice, he teaches crafts, he passes down rules, he negotiates. When you remove the divine framing, his actions resemble those of a leader responsible for guiding a developing community. In other regions, such figures appear as culture heroes. Sometimes they arrive from distant lands, sometimes they emerge after a great disaster, sometimes they lead survivors to new territories. The supernatural aspects added later do not erase the possibility that the stories began with real individuals. In Greek mythology, the gods also behave intensely human. They argue, they show favoritism, they involve themselves in disputes, they teach certain individuals, they interact directly with communities. While later interpretations emphasize the divine aspect, the earliest versions often portray them as figures with lineage, culture, and limitations. The earliest Greek myths do not describe distant, abstract gods. They describe beings who live on a mountain nearby, who visit humans regularly, who intervene in mundane affairs. In many indigenous traditions of North America, similar figures appear. Some are described as ancient people who taught tribes how to live in harmony with the land. Others are described as wandering teachers who arrived long ago, sharing knowledge and then leaving. These stories don't sound like interactions with supernatural beings. They sound like memories of contact between groups who developed different types of knowledge at different times. What's interesting is that many of these teacher figures behave predictably. They appear after a major catastrophe. They arrive when communities are rebuilding. They help organize people. They share knowledge essential for survival. Then they leave. This pattern appears everywhere. It suggests that early humans experienced cycles of collapse and recovery. When survivors from more advanced groups met less affected populations, those survivors brought skills that seemed miraculous. Over generations, the memory of their help became mythologized. Another example appears in Pacific Island traditions. Many of the stories describe visitors arriving by sea. These visitors teach navigation, fishing techniques, agriculture, or community structure. They are remembered as semi-divine or as culture heroes. The supernatural layer grows over time, but the underlying event resembles a real encounter between groups separated by geography but connected by migration. In Australian Aboriginal stories, there are tales of beings known as clever men or ancestors who shaped the land, established customs, and taught essential skills. The supernatural interpretation is modern. The original stories often describe these beings walking the land as humans, teaching through practical action. The exaggeration came later. The foundation was human. Another global pattern appears in myths that describe gods who could be injured, defeated, or even killed. Truly divine beings wouldn't be vulnerable. But these mythic figures often face dangers, suffer consequences, or make mistakes. This reveals something important. They weren't originally conceptualized as all-powerful. They were remembered as influential but fallible. They were remembered as leaders or teachers whose lives impacted the community strongly enough to be preserved. In African myths, figures like Ogun, Shango, and Nyame exhibit human behaviours and cultural traits. They perform practical tasks, they intervene in disputes, they display strengths and weaknesses. Their stories reflect real social structures. The supernatural elements attached to them later often mask a more grounded origin. The overlap across continents suggests that the mythic pattern of gods behaving like humans may reflect memories of real individuals. People who led communities during transitional periods, people who brought knowledge from older cultures, people whose skills were rare enough to seem extraordinary, people who influenced the foundation of future societies. A deeper layer of similarity appears in myths about conflicts among gods. These conflicts often resemble human political struggles. They involve disagreements over territory, leadership, laws, or resources. They involve alliances and betrayals. They involve decisions that impact groups of people. These narratives could reflect memories of early conflicts between human groups. As stories were retold over generations, the individuals involved became mythic figures. Their human struggles evolved into cosmic battles. But the underlying dynamics remained the same: leadership disputes, migrations caused by conflict, or changes in social structure. Another interesting detail is that mythic gods often have families, lineages, or ancestry. They have parents, siblings, spouses, or children. They pass down knowledge through familial lines. These traits mirror human socio-cultural systems. In many myths, the gods who teach humans are part of a specific lineage. This suggests that the original stories remembered individuals belonging to particular clans or groups. Over time, these groups became elevated into divine families. Another pattern appears in myths that describe gods interacting directly with early humans. These stories often involve training, instruction, or assistance. In some myths, the gods teach humans how to use new materials like metal or pottery. In others, they show humans how to track stars or navigate the seas. These interactions sound like cultural transmission, not divine revelation. They sound like memories of real relationships between groups with different levels of knowledge. One of the most curious patterns is that many gods are described as taller than ordinary people. Not impossibly tall, but noticeably taller. This detail appears in myths from Europe, the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The consistency is unusual. It suggests that early humans encountered groups that were physically distinct in some way. These individuals might have come from regions with different diets, different environmental conditions, or different evolutionary pressures. Their height alone could make them appear remarkable. Combined with their knowledge, they would be remembered for generations. Another shared detail is the use of specific tools by these mythic figures. Some myths describe gods with metal tools long before the culture itself used metal. Others describe advanced methods of construction. Others describe measurement systems or astronomical alignments. These details may reflect memories of older cultures whose technologies were lost after collapse. When people rediscovered these traditions later, they framed them as divine teachings. Gods in mythology also frequently travel. They visit multiple communities. They move across landscapes. They bring knowledge to different regions. This mobility is unusual for supernatural beings, but common for human leaders, explorers, or survivors of collapsed societies. If early humans lived through periods of major environmental change, groups would have moved regularly. Leaders or skilled individuals would have travelled between settlements to share resources or information. These movements could easily become mythological journeys over time. Another striking feature is that many gods die. This is especially common in myths that preserve very old memories. The deaths are dramatic, but they are still deaths. This reveals something important. These beings were originally remembered as mortal. Their deaths were significant events that shaped early communities. As the stories grew, their deaths became symbolic, but the origin was likely a real person whose life and death mattered. In some myths, gods or ancestors fall ill, age, or become weak. This doesn't align with a divine being. It aligns with a human leader whose later years were remembered with emotional weight. The story becomes mythic, but the human core stays visible. Some myths describe gods who marry humans or have children with them. These stories are symbolic, but they may reflect the merging of different groups. When an influential outsider joined a local community and their descendants became important leaders, the story would reflect that union. Over generations, the outsider would become mythologized, and the merging of lineages would become a story of gods mingling with humans. Another intriguing detail is that gods often leave. They don't die, they don't vanish. They leave deliberately. They say they will return or say that their work is done. This is common across many cultures. These departures resemble migrations or relocations. If a group of influential individuals moved on after teaching or assisting, the locals would remember that departure. Over time, the story would become part of their mythology. All these patterns point to the same idea. Myths remember people, not ordinary people, but individuals who played extraordinary roles during transitional periods of disaster, periods of migration, periods of rebuilding. Their actions were preserved, enlarged, transformed, and encoded in story. The supernatural elements were added gradually, but the human core remained. And these shared patterns across distant cultures suggest that early humans everywhere experienced similar cycles of collapse and renewal. They remembered the individuals who guided them through those cycles. They passed down the memory for generations, and those memories eventually became the gods who behaved so much like people. For the earliest humans, storytelling wasn't entertainment. It was survival. It was memory. It was the only method they had to carry knowledge across generations. They couldn't write anything down. They couldn't carve every detail into stone. They couldn't record measurements or map landscapes or archive events. What they carried in their minds was all they had, and what they shared through their voices was the only way to make sure the next generation understood what the previous one had lived through. This creates an unusual duality in oral tradition. It distorts, and it preserves. It stretches what cannot be explained directly, and it protects what cannot be forgotten. These two forces, distortion and preservation, operate at the same time, shaping stories into something that holds emotional truth even when the literal details shift. This is what makes mythology such an important artifact of human history. It shows how people understood their world through memory, not measurement. When the earliest communities told stories, they didn't repeat them word for word like a script. They adapted them to the moment, to the listeners, to the setting, and to the teller's own understanding. The core remained, but the surface changed. This flexibility allowed stories to travel across enormous stretches of time, but it also meant that the details evolved with each retelling. As a result, myths today often look larger than life. But beneath the scale and symbolism lies something much simpler: an experience, a memory, a lesson, a person, a place, an event worth passing down. The distortion process begins the moment a story is told for the first time. A person recounts something they lived through, but they describe it through their senses and emotions. They do not separate the objective event from the subjective experience. If a storm terrified them, the story reflects the fear. If a volcanic eruption felt like the world ending, the story carries that weight. If a migration was long and exhausting, the story emphasizes the struggle. This emotional framing becomes part of the memory, and the next generation inherits not just the facts, but the feelings. Over time, these emotional layers merge with cultural values. A story about a flood becomes a story about renewal. A story about a fire becomes a warning. A story about a wandering teacher becomes a legend about divine knowledge. The story changes, but the event that inspired it remains encoded inside the narrative. That is how oral storytelling distorts. But alongside the distortion, there is a surprising level of preservation. Even when details drift, certain elements remain remarkably stable. The structure of the event, the order of changes, the scale of the impact, the type of disaster, the lesson attached to the memory. These elements survive because they matter. They form the core of the story. They are what people want the next generation to remember. Consider a community that survives a flood. The details might change, how high the water was, how long it lasted, who survived. But the key point remains. The water rose and changed everything. This core memory becomes the anchor. As long as the core remains intact, the story preserves the event. Even if centuries pass, and even if the explanation becomes mythological, the memory survives. Another example comes from volcanoes. People describe eruptions in dramatic ways, but certain aspects remain consistent across cultures. The darkness, the ash, the heat, the sound, the disruption. These sensory experiences remain embedded in stories long after the scientific explanation is forgotten. Even if the surviving culture moves far from the volcano's original location, the story persists. As generations pass, the eruption becomes a battle between giants or a conflict between gods. But the memory of the darkness remains. The emotional signature stays intact. That is the preservation. Oral storytelling also preserves social structures. Many myths describe the roles of leaders and teachers within early communities. These figures appear exaggerated in later retellings, but their influence survives. If a leader guided a group through a crisis, the story keeps their memory alive. Over generations, the leader may become mythologized into a semi-divine figure, but the essence of their actions remains recognizable. They taught, they protected, they organized, they made decisions that shaped the future of the group. Stories magnify their deeds, but they do not erase them. Another way oral tradition preserves information is through repetition. In many early cultures, children heard the same stories hundreds of times throughout their lives. The repetition ensured that even if some details slipped, the essential structure remained unbroken. This is similar to how families repeat certain anecdotes across generations. The story changes, but the meaningful part remains. In some communities, storytellers served as memory keepers. They were trained to remember long sequences, genealogies, migrations, or events. These individuals treated storytelling as a responsibility. They listened to elders, memorized the structure, and passed it forward. Even though some details evolved over time, the presence of dedicated memory keepers dramatically reduced the rate of drift. This is why some myths contain surprising accuracy. They were protected by individuals whose duty was to maintain continuity. Another part of preservation comes from imagery. Humans remember visual information more easily than abstract information. When early storytellers described events, they used images: a burning sky, a rising sea, a mountain that shook, a river that changed course. These images anchor the memory. Even if the explanation changes, the visual core remains. This is why myths around the world describe similar imagery for similar events. The imagery is what survived. But distortion also has a pattern. It reflects the needs of each generation. When a community faces a new challenge, they sometimes reshape older stories to match current concerns. If they experience drought, old stories involving fire gain new relevance. If they experience conflict with another group, old stories about ancient battles become more prominent. The core memory adapts to new circumstances. This keeps the story alive but gradually shifts its surface. Despite this shifting surface, oral traditions often preserve chronological order, even when they lose specific dates. This means that myths describing sequences of events often maintain the actual sequence, even if the details surrounding them change. A catastrophe often comes before a migration in both myth and real events. A period of abundance often comes before a collapse. A new leader often appears after a crisis. These sequences remain because they are intuitive and emotionally significant. People remember the order even if they forget the cause. Another layer of preservation is found in the consistency of themes across generations. If a story warns against a specific behaviour or praises a specific trait, that moral core remains stable. Even if characters or settings shift, the lesson persists. The lesson is what anchors the memory. This is why so many myths carry messages about adapting to change, respecting nature, helping others, or preparing for hardship. These are lessons people wanted their descendants to remember, especially in societies vulnerable to environmental change. Oral storytelling also preserves sensory details. People remember how something felt. They remember cold, heat, noise, hunger, fear, awe. These sensations become part of the story. When the next generation retells it, they emphasize the sensation even if the event details blur. This is why many myths describing disasters sound emotionally accurate. The fear remains, the confusion remains, the sense of scale remains. As stories travel across generations, they also accumulate new layers. Each generation adds their own experiences, blending them with the older memory. Over time, the story becomes part of the culture's identity. It reflects both the original event and the many retellings that came after. This layering doesn't erase the original memory. It displays how the culture processed and understood the memory across time. In some cases, oral traditions preserved events so accurately that modern researchers only recognise the truth recently. For example, some Indigenous Australian groups preserved stories describing shorelines that existed before sea level rise thousands of years ago. When modern researchers mapped these regions, they found the stories matched geological evidence. The details were symbolic, but the core memory was correct. This demonstrates how long oral tradition can preserve information when the story remains important to the community. Another notable example involves Native American tribes, who preserved memories of volcanic eruptions from thousands of years ago. The myths described the mountain as alive or angry, but the descriptions of ash, fire and shaking matched geological events exactly. This shows how symbolism coexists with factual memory. The symbol helps preserve the event even when the scientific explanation is unknown. Another interesting aspect is that oral storytelling often encodes information in patterns that are easy to remember. Rhythmic phrasing, repetition, and symbolic language help the memory survive, even if the story is not perfectly literal. This is not poetic rhythm as we understand it. It is functional memory design. It keeps the structure intact. It reduces information loss. It allows stories to endure for thousands of years. But because of this encoding, the outer surface of the story can look fantastical. The imagery grows. The characters evolve. The world becomes larger than life. This is where distortion happens. But the underlying memory survives because the structure remains stable. Another way oral storytelling preserves information is through collective memory. In many early societies, stories were not told by one person alone. They were shared among groups. This collective retelling acts like cross-checking. If someone altered the story too much, others would correct them. This form of communal editing ensured stability even without writing. It allowed stories to last far longer than individual lifespans. Even when cultures split and move into new regions, the core stories often travel with them. As a group migrates, their descendants retell the same stories, but in new environments. Over time, the details adapt to the new landscape, but the structure remains. This is why different cultures can share similar myths even after thousands of years of separation. They inherited the same early memories before they split. This process explains why myths about floods, fires, sky events, migrations, lost lands, and ancient teachers appear everywhere. People carried these memories with them as they spread across the world. Each culture reshaped the story to fit their environment, but the core remained. Another interesting factor in oral storytelling is the human tendency to exaggerate. When someone retells a dramatic event, they often amplify the intensity. This exaggeration is not deliberate deception. It reflects emotional memory. If an event felt overwhelming, the storyteller conveys that feeling through scale. This makes the story more vivid and easier to remember. It also preserves the emotional truth even if the literal details become larger than life. Distortion also occurs when people attach supernatural explanations to unknown phenomena. When early communities lacked scientific frameworks, they explained events through intention or character. A storm became anger, a volcano became power, a flood became punishment. These explanations distort the literal cause, but they preserve the significance. The story becomes memorable, and the memory survives. Another aspect of both distortion and preservation is the role of symbols. A symbol condenses meaning into a single image, making it easier to remember. For example, a fire god might represent both an actual person who taught fire skills and the memory of a catastrophic wildfire. The symbol blends multiple layers into one figure. This distorts the historical origin but preserves the event and its emotional impact. As oral traditions grow, people incorporate new experiences into old frameworks. When a culture encounters another group, they blend their stories. When they experience a new disaster, they merge it with older memories. This blending distorts the original narrative but prevents it from disappearing entirely. It becomes part of a larger cultural memory. The core survives because it becomes embedded in something bigger. Another interesting pattern is that oral traditions often preserve what is most difficult to explain. People remember what challenges their understanding. They remember the extraordinary. They remember the overwhelming. These events create stronger stories. They create stories that last. They are less likely to be forgotten because they stand out emotionally. This explains why myths often focus on disasters, strange phenomena, migrations, or encounters with unusual groups. Ordinary life does not create long-lasting stories. Extraordinary life does. Oral storytelling also preserves the identity of a community. Many myths explain where people came from, what shaped their ancestors, or what their culture values. These identity stories remain stable even when other details drift. They are retold with care. They anchor the community emotionally. This makes them particularly resistant to distortion in their core structure. As people move deeper into later myths, the distortion becomes more visible, but the preservation becomes clearer as well. Myths begin to show layered memories. They reveal traces of earlier cultures. They contain clues about migrations, environmental changes, and lost knowledge. The distortion masks these clues on the surface, but the preservation protects them underneath. The logical sciences usually begin with tools, measurements, and carefully controlled observations, but archaeology often begins with something much quieter. Someone notices an unusual stone sitting in a place where it doesn't belong. Someone else finds a fragment of pottery under soil that should have been untouched. A researcher digs into a hillside and finds an alignment that seems too deliberate to be natural. There's rarely a loud discovery moment. Instead, clues accumulate slowly. A site that looked like nothing becomes something. A pattern that seemed accidental starts forming a clear shape. And over time, these shapes begin echoing stories that have circulated for thousands of years. Myths and archaeology are often treated as opposites. One belongs to science, the other to storytelling. But when you look closely, especially at very old sites, they don't behave like opposites at all. They seem to talk to each other. Not in a way that proves myths literally true, and not in a way that turns archaeology into fiction, but in a way that suggests both are trying to describe the same world using different languages. Archaeology uses soil, stone, carbon, and artifacts. Myth uses memory, imagery, fear, awe, and repetition. When those languages overlap, it becomes difficult to ignore the possibility that many myths contain fragments of genuine history. For a long time, archaeology dismissed myths almost entirely. Early researchers looked at stories as imaginative explanations for people who lacked scientific understanding. When an ancient culture described a flood that wiped out an earlier age, it was simply a symbolic story. When they described gods arriving after a catastrophe, it was assumed to be metaphor. When they mentioned an earlier world destroyed by fire or ice or darkness, those details were written off as creative exaggeration. But as methods improved, archaeologists started uncovering evidence that looked strangely familiar. Evidence that reflected the emotional tone of myths, even if the details were different. Large-scale flooding events turned out to be real. Sudden cooling periods were confirmed through ice cores. Massive eruptions left traces across continents. Sea levels rose quickly at the end of the last ice age. Entire areas that once supported human communities were swallowed by water. Ash layers matched the timing of oral traditions describing darkness falling over the land. Slowly, archaeology began realizing that myths often preserved memories of events long before writing existed. One of the earliest examples of this shift came from stories surrounding lost lands. Cultures all over the world talk about regions that once existed but were destroyed or submerged. For most of archaeological history, these were considered fantasy. Lost islands, sunken cities, vanished coastlines. They sounded too dramatic to be real. But as underwater archaeology expanded, a different picture emerged. Researchers found stone structures offshore in places where no modern coastline exists. They found ancient pathways now buried under the sea. They found remnants of settlements in areas believed uninhabited during the dates suggested by the myths. These discoveries didn't prove the existence of legendary continents, but they demonstrated a clear truth. People passed down memories of vanished landscapes. When an island sank due to rising waters or land subsidence, the event left a mark that lasted in memory far longer than the ruins themselves. Myths preserved those memories. When archaeology later uncovered evidence of the physical change, it found itself unexpectedly aligned with the stories. Another example comes from catastrophes described in myths that once seemed impossible. Many traditions talk about mountains exploding, skies darkening, or the land shaking violently. Without evidence, these stories were labelled symbolic. But as archaeological and geological research improved, scientists identified past volcanic eruptions that affected entire regions. Some were so enormous that their impact could be felt hundreds or thousands of kilometres away. They left behind ash layers detectable in soil strata. They altered climate for years, they caused population shifts, and they matched the timeframes of oral traditions describing chaos, darkness, cold, or mass migrations. Archaeologists noticed that the stories didn't describe the technical details of eruptions, but they captured the experience accurately. The emotional memory preserved what mattered: the fear, the disorientation, the environmental change. These emotional signatures corresponded to real events. Myth carried what archaeology later confirmed. Another area where archaeology and myth intersect is the memory of ancient groups who disappeared long before written records. Many cultures describe earlier peoples who lived differently, built differently, or possessed knowledge that later groups lacked. Stories about giants, ancestors with great strength, or people who built structures the current population couldn't replicate were often written off as imaginative exaggeration. But archaeology uncovered evidence of older populations that predated known cultures. In some regions, megalithic structures appeared long before the societies traditionally credited with building them. In others, tools or carvings displayed skill levels unexpected for the assumed time period. Archaeologists began realizing that myths weren't inventing earlier peoples, they were remembering them. The memory was distorted, but it was accurate enough to reflect the existence of cultures that influenced later groups. Myths may have exaggerated size, abilities, or origin stories, but they preserved the idea that others came before us. Archaeology found those others buried in the ground. Myth kept them alive in story form. Another area of overlap involves migration. Many oral traditions describe long journeys undertaken by ancestors. Some mention crossing lands that no longer exist. Others describe moving from regions far beyond what archaeology once believed possible. For a long time, these migration stories were treated as symbolic, but as genetic research and archaeological mapping advanced, many of those journeys were confirmed. Cultures that believed they originated in distant areas were telling the truth. Their ancestors had migrated from those regions thousands of years ago. The myths preserved the memory of these journeys even when the physical trails vanished. Another important conversation between archaeology and myth involves knowledge. Many myths describe teachers or figures who introduced essential skills to communities. This once seemed purely supernatural, but archaeological evidence shows that knowledge often spread through interactions between groups after environmental changes. Tools suddenly appear in regions far from their origin. Farming techniques spread rapidly after climatic shifts. Settlement patterns change when a new group arrives in an area. These shifts resemble the mythic stories of visitors teaching new skills. Archaeologists began understanding that myths didn't describe gods. They described cultural transmission. They remembered people who carried knowledge from one region to another. The mythological framing distorted the details, but the underlying memory remained accurate. Archaeologists found the physical evidence of these transitions. Myths preserved the human experience of them. Archaeology also uncovered something fascinating about the earlier settlements. They appeared with a level of organization that suggested humans had experience building communities long before the earliest known cities. Some sites thousands of years older than recognized civilizations show signs of planning, ritual spaces, and structured layouts. This aligns with myths describing earlier ages of humanity that ended in disaster. Archaeology found physical hints of these earlier experiments in civilization. Myth preserved their memory. One of the most striking convergences between archaeology and mythology appears in stories describing dramatic environmental transitions. Myths often describe a world that looked different from the present. They talk about forests where deserts now stand. They talk about ice where grasslands exist today. They talk about rivers shifting, animals disappearing, or seasons changing unpredictably. These descriptions were read symbolically for generations, but archaeology and climatology eventually confirmed that these environmental changes happened. Landscapes transformed rapidly after the last ice age. Animals went extinct. Weather patterns shifted. Archaeologists found evidence of human populations adapting to these changes. Myths describe the emotional and cultural impact of those adaptations. The surface imagery differed, but the underlying truth matched. In some regions, myths describe great fires sweeping across the land. Archaeologists found layers of charcoal and ash corresponding to massive wildfires that occurred thousands of years ago. In other regions, myths recall long periods of darkness or cold. Archaeologists found evidence of volcanic winters that caused similar conditions. The parallels were too close to ignore. These weren't coincidences, they were shared memories preserved in different forms. One of the most important contributions archaeology made to the understanding of myth came from studying ancient settlement layers. When researchers dug deep enough, they often found sudden breaks in occupation, a layer of destruction, a long gap before reoccupation, signs of abandonment. Sometimes the cause was environmental, sometimes it was a natural disaster, sometimes it was conflict. Myths from the region often carried stories about the same kind of event. The surface layers of myth distorted the explanation, but the emotional core matched the archaeological evidence. Another surprising alignment occurs in myths that describe ancient structures built by beings other than the current population. Archaeology found monuments built by earlier groups whose identities were unknown or unclear. When later cultures encountered these monuments, they incorporated them into their origin stories. Myth remembered these structures even after the builders disappeared. Archaeology uncovered the physical truth. The two perspectives described the same phenomenon through different lenses. The relationship between archaeology and myth became even clearer when researchers started studying how communities respond to disasters. Modern anthropological studies show that communities preserve traumatic events in narrative form for generations. The emotional details remain vivid. The factual details become flexible. This is exactly what ancient myths look like. They are emotional memories wrapped in symbolic explanations. Archaeology found physical evidence of disasters. Myth preserved the emotional experience of living through them. Neither is complete alone, but together they form a more comprehensive understanding of early human life. Archaeology also discovered that cultural memory can survive far longer than expected. In some regions, myths preserved accurate descriptions of geographic features that disappeared thousands of years ago. In others, stories recorded the sequence of events during environmental transitions that science only recently confirmed. Archaeology provided the timeline. Myth provided the lived experience. Another example of this quiet conversation appears when archaeologists uncover rituals or symbolic carvings that reflect mythic themes. Stories about serpents guarding the underworld appear in regions where snake fossils were found near burial grounds. Stories about sky figures appear near sites aligned with solar or lunar events. Archaeology found the physical expression of beliefs held by ancient people. Myth preserved the narrative expression. One of the most compelling intersections between archaeology and myth involves the oldest human sites. Some of these sites predate written history by tens of thousands of years. They contain carvings, alignments, or remnants whose purpose remains unclear. When archaeologists compare these findings with nearby myths, patterns sometimes emerge. A carving that appears symbolic turns out to reflect a story preserved in local traditions. A structure aligned with solstices matches a creation story about the movement of the sun. These aren't proofs, but they are echoes that grow clearer as both fields advance. Archaeology does not confirm myths in a literal sense. Myths don't confirm archaeology either, but they complement each other. Myth provides clues about what mattered to ancient people. Archaeology provides the physical traces. When those clues and traces align, a clearer picture emerges of the world as it once was. A world shaped by catastrophes, migrations, encounters, forgotten knowledge, and the rise and fall of early societies. A world preserved partly in the ground and partly in memory. Ancient stories often seem like distant echoes of a world shaped by imagination, but there is another way to look at them that becomes clearer when you pay attention to the kinds of information they carry. Many myths describe things that go far beyond spiritual beliefs or moral lessons. They contain instructions, directions, warnings, sequences, observations about weather, geography, plants, animals, stars, and migration routes. At first, those details look like decorations around the story, but the deeper you go, the more they start behaving like something functional. They behave like maps. Not maps in the modern sense, with grids and labels, but maps made of memory. Maps that helped people move through landscapes, understand seasonal cycles, track animals, locate water sources, or avoid danger. Myths may appear symbolic, but much of their structure is shaped by the early human need to remember practical knowledge long before writing existed. Knowledge didn't survive by accident. Early communities depended on it to live. How to find food, how to store it, how to travel safely, how to avoid hazards, how to recognize environmental signs. Without writing, information had to be memorable. It had to hold attention. It had to carry meaning strong enough to survive countless retellings. Mythology became the structure that held that meaning. When a story included a lesson or a pattern that mattered, it stayed. When something wasn't useful, it faded. Over time, the stories that lasted longest were the ones that contained something essential, something people needed. In some parts of the world, stories about animals are commonly interpreted as symbolic or spiritual, but many of them contain direct ecological knowledge. A myth might say a certain animal behaves a certain way because of a spirit or a god, but the behavior described is accurate. It tells you when the animal appears, where it migrates, which conditions bring it out, and which signs signal its arrival. The supernatural explanation becomes a memory anchor. It preserves information people needed to survive. When a story tells you that a creature wakes during a specific time and travels in a specific direction, it's describing migration patterns. When it says an animal comes down from the mountains when certain stars rise, it's recording seasonal timing. These connections become clearer when stories describe the sky. Many myths explain star patterns as characters or creatures, but the movement described is factual. The rising of a certain constellation signals seasonal change. The disappearance of another signals planting time. Some myths describe the path of the sun or the moon with surprising accuracy. Others describe how the stars shift slightly over long periods. These details didn't happen by chance. They came from observation. Generations watched the sky, passed the knowledge down and encoded it into stories that could survive without written charts. In some cultures, myths describe the shape of coastlines or mountains in surprisingly consistent ways. They describe caves where water flows even in dry seasons. They describe safe passages through valleys that look impassable at first glance. They describe landmarks visible from far distances that guide travellers back home. When researchers examine these landscapes, they often discover that the mythical descriptions match real geography. What sounds like a story about a giant carving a river is actually a description of how that river formed, where it flows, and how it can be crossed safely. The exaggeration distorts the cause, but not the layout. It preserves the map. Another part of ancient knowledge encoded in myths involves resource locations. Stories that talk about sacred groves or forbidden forests often align with regions containing rare plants. Myths about mountains inhabited by powerful beings sometimes correspond to areas containing valuable minerals. When early humans found something important, they created a story strong enough to protect the memory. The supernatural framing discouraged careless behaviour. It guided people toward or away from the resource without needing technical explanation. There are also myths that describe the behaviour of rivers, lakes, tides, and winds. Many stories explain these forces through the actions of beings who push or pull the water or who blow across the land. But the behaviour described is accurate. They document which river floods regularly, which areas become dangerous at certain times of year, whether water disappears underground, whether wind shifts at sunset, or how the tides behave in certain phases of the moon. These details helped people navigate their environment safely. Myth became a way to remember water patterns before people had charts or written calendars. Another layer of knowledge preserved in myth involves environmental danger. Many cultures tell stories about places where spirits harm people or where gods punish trespassers. When researchers examine those areas, they often find hazards. Sometimes it's unstable ground. Sometimes it's toxic gas emissions. Sometimes it's dangerous wildlife. Sometimes it's cliffs or sinkholes. The story protects people by attaching fear or respect to the location. The supernatural framing isn't the point, the survival knowledge is. Some myths describe disasters not as one-time events, but as cycles. They talk about worlds ending and new ones beginning. They talk about floods that recur. They talk about long winters that return. They talk about fire sweeping across the land more than once. These cycles often mirror natural patterns that early humans observed. Volcanic eruptions recur. Rivers flood periodically. Climate shifts happen in waves. When people noticed these long-term patterns, they folded the knowledge into stories that taught future generations what to expect. Other myths contain warnings about overusing resources. Stories about spirits punishing greed often reflect real ecological consequences. If a community hunted too many animals, food sources collapsed. If they cut down too many trees, water levels dropped. Myths framed these consequences as supernatural because the underlying ecological mechanisms weren't known. But the story preserved the principle: take only what you need, or the land will stop providing. The lesson became a cultural rule encoded in narrative form. Many myths describe how specific plants should be used. The story might involve a deity teaching humans which plants heal and which harm. When researchers study these plants today, they often find that the story reflects real medicinal properties. Plants with healing effects appear in myths as gifts or blessings. Plants with toxic properties appear in myths as cursed or dangerous. The myth preserves practical knowledge. It helps people remember which plants are safe long before written herbals existed. Another area where myth functions as a memory map involves migration. Some traditions describe ancestral journeys step by step. They mention mountains, rivers, valleys, and coastlines in sequential order. While the mythic framing might include supernatural beings guiding the travellers, the route often matches archaeological evidence. The story exaggerates the motives or events, but preserves the order of places visited. This suggests that people use stories to document migration routes, turning geography into narrative memory. In some cultures, myths even describe how to build structures. They mention the right time of year to gather certain materials. They mention the hardships involved. They mention rituals that coincide with practical tasks, such as aligning structures with celestial events. These rituals often correspond to real techniques. For example, a story might say a deity told people to orient a building toward a certain star. While the myth explains this in symbolic terms, the result is a structure aligned with astronomical precision. The practical knowledge survived because the story made it memorable. Myths also preserve knowledge about climate patterns. When early humans noticed long-term changes, they documented them through story. If winters gradually became harsher, the story might describe an ancient being withholding warmth. If summers grew longer, the story might describe a spirit enlarging the sun. These explanations distill complex observations into something easy to remember. Over generations, the literal memory fades, but the story continues to warn people about changes in seasonal cycles. Certain myths describe star alignments with a level of detail that seems surprising for groups without advanced tools. They describe how stars shift slightly over time. They describe long cycles that take thousands of years to complete. This suggests that people observed celestial patterns across many generations and used stories to preserve the knowledge. Myths became a way to transmit astronomical observations without written records. The story held the memory until the next generation was ready to take on the role of observer. Another form of ancient knowledge preserved in myth involves navigation. Many cultures relied on ocean travel long before writing existed. They used stars, currents, bird behaviour, and wave patterns to navigate. These details are encoded in myths about sea gods or sky travellers. A story might say a traveller followed a certain star to reach a distant island. Beneath the supernatural details is a navigation technique. The myth served as a guide for journeys across the sea. Stories about underground worlds often preserve knowledge about caves or shelters used during extreme weather. Some describe places where people escape the heat or cold. Others describe safe routes through underground passages. While the story frames these places as mystical or forbidden, they often correspond to real geological features used as refuges. Another interesting pattern appears in myths that describe the timing of rituals. Many rituals are tied to astronomical events like solstices or equinoxes. The ritual preserves the timing. Even if the original purpose is forgotten, the act of performing the ritual ensures that the community remains in sync with seasonal cycles. This is an indirect map. It keeps people aligned with natural rhythms that influence agriculture, migration, or weather. Some myths contain surprisingly accurate depictions of past environments. They describe animals that no longer exist. They describe forests where deserts now stand. They describe rivers running through areas now dry. This suggests that the stories preserved memories of landscapes before climate changes altered them. Archaeology later confirmed these ancient environments. Myth carried the memory long after the land itself changed. In certain regions, myths describe the movement of glaciers or the formation of lakes. These stories sound impossible at first, because glacier movement is slow relative to human lifespans, but communities living near ice sheets observed signs of movement, creaking sounds, falling ice, shifting boundaries. They preserved those observations through story. When researchers study glacial retreat, they find that the myths describe the sequence of changes accurately. The story distorted the agents behind the movement, but preserved the order and scale. Another role myths played was to encode knowledge about animal behaviour during environmental stress. If prey animals changed migration routes, people needed to know why. A myth might describe a spirit moving the animals, but the behavioural pattern described is usually correct. People remembered the story for generations because it helped them survive. The myth became a functional map to where food would be found. In many oral traditions, myths describe star patterns not only for navigation but for agriculture. The appearance of a certain constellation might signal planting time, another might signal harvest. This knowledge had to be preserved precisely. If planting happened too early or too late, crops failed. Myth anchored the timing to memorable imagery. The supernatural framing didn't weaken the accuracy, it strengthened the memory. Some myths describe the behaviour of water sources in surprising detail. They mention springs that appear only during certain seasons. They mention pools that drain underground. They mention rivers that reverse direction during floods. Modern hydrology confirms these patterns. Myth preserved them long before scientific explanation existed. Other myths describe the sound of earth movement. Stories that mention growling mountains or shaking ground often reflect early observations of seismic activity. People didn't understand fault lines, but they recognized the signs. They preserved the knowledge of dangerous areas through narrative. Later generations used these stories to avoid certain regions. There are also myths that encode astronomical cycles far longer than the lifespans of individual humans. Some cultures describe cycles lasting thousands of years. This suggests that observational knowledge accumulated over many generations. The only way to preserve such long-term knowledge without writing was through story. Myth became the vessel for multi-generational scientific memory. Another kind of map hidden in myth involves social structures. Some stories explain how to organize communities, divide resources, or establish roles. The mythic origin gives the rule weight and makes it memorable. The story preserves social knowledge that helped the community function during difficult times. Many myths use relational patterns to encode environmental information. For example, a story might say that one being follows another across the sky. This describes the order in which constellations rise. The relationship between the characters preserves the sequence. The order becomes easy to remember because it is attached to narrative structure. Some myths describe cycles of abundance and scarcity. They frame these cycles through the actions of supernatural beings, but the pattern reflects real ecological cycles. These stories helped communities prepare for periods of hardship. The myth preserved the memory of past cycles, allowing people to anticipate future ones. In certain regions, myths describe the sound of wind or storms behaving in specific ways before major changes. These descriptions often match weather patterns associated with seasonal transitions. The story preserves early meteorological observations through memorable detail. When you look at all these forms of knowledge together, a pattern emerges. Myths weren't just stories, they were memory systems. They allowed people to track stars, seasons, water, animals, and danger. They allowed people to remember landscapes long after they changed. They allowed knowledge to survive the collapse of earlier societies and the movement of populations into new regions. The mythic surface evolved, but the underlying information remained. Questions about the origins of civilization normally begin with familiar places and familiar dates. Textbooks point to river valleys in Mesopotamia, the Nile Basin, the Indus region, early settlements in China. These regions represent organized societies with writing, architecture, agriculture, and recognizable social structures. But those dates fall surprisingly late in the human timeline. When you place them against the backdrop of human evolution, They appear suddenly, almost abruptly, as if people spent hundreds of thousands of years learning only the basics before everything changed within a relatively short window. The usual explanation is that agriculture triggered complexity. Once people farmed successfully, larger communities formed and civilization followed. But new discoveries in archaeology, genetics, climatology, and anthropology are shifting the picture. They reveal traces of organization, innovation, and cultural depth that appear far earlier than traditional timelines suggest. These traces raise the possibility that civilizations, or something close to them, may have risen long before the earliest known cities emerged. The first sign that the timeline might be incomplete comes from the scale and sophistication of ancient structures uncovered in recent decades. Some sites thousands of years older than the earliest recognized civilizations show planning, organization, and astronomical awareness. The structures are not random piles of stone or accidental formations. They reflect intentional design. They reveal labor cooperation, resource management, and knowledge of seasonal cycles. These characteristics indicate social complexity. They suggest leadership, planning, and communication far beyond what was expected for those periods. If small groups were capable of building such advanced structures, then the idea that civilization began suddenly becomes much harder to defend. Other discoveries come from prehistoric art and symbolic artifacts. Humans began creating figurines, carvings, and wall paintings long before agriculture. These artifacts show not only artistic sensibility, but also shared symbols across regions. Shared symbols require communication and cultural stability. They suggest that early humans maintained social networks over long distances, trading ideas as well as objects. This kind of social cohesion resembles the foundation of civilization. People connected through shared beliefs and practices. The symbols themselves might not represent cities or states, but they show that human culture was far more organized than previously assumed. Another important shift in understanding comes from studying ancient burials. Burial practices reveal how early societies viewed death, identity, and community. Some burials from tens of thousands of years ago contain grave goods, pigments, beads, tools, or ornaments. These items reflect value systems. They imply that early humans invested time and effort into honoring individuals. This suggests a form of social hierarchy or respect for specialized roles. Burials with complex ritual patterns imply structured belief systems. These systems represent cultural continuity, a hallmark of civilization. If early societies practiced these rituals consistently, they were more than loose bands of nomads. They were communities with identity, tradition, and memory. Genetics also contributes to the evolving picture. Studies of ancient DNA show that human populations migrated, merged, separated, and reconnected in patterns far more intricate than previously recognized. These patterns indicate that early humans interacted across vast distances. These interactions brought cultural exchange. They moved knowledge, ideas, and skills between groups. Such exchanges can accelerate development. If knowledge was spreading rapidly between groups long before the first cities, then cultural complexity may have existed long before formal civilization appeared. Another sign of earlier complexity comes from tools. Stone tools evolved gradually for hundreds of thousands of years, but at certain points leaps occur. Techniques suddenly improve. Tools become more refined, more specialized, or more efficient. These leaps happen in multiple regions. They suggest innovation spreading through networks of communication. Innovation requires teaching. Teaching requires stable communities. Stable communities require organized structure. These patterns, taken together, imply something like a proto-civilization long before the oldest known cities. Patterns in settlement also reveal surprising depth. Even before agriculture, some groups returned seasonally to the same locations for long periods. They established recurring camps. They built shelters. They created gathering places. They stored resources in predictable ways. These behaviours reflect attachment to place. They reflect planning beyond the immediate moment. Once people began returning to the same areas year after year, it created opportunities for shared memory, tradition, and coordinated work. These settlements weren't permanent cities, but they formed the social groundwork from which cities could eventually emerge. Another important area of research involves submerged landscapes. After the last ice age, sea levels rose dramatically, covering large portions of coastal land where humans once lived. These submerged areas could hold clues to earlier societies, but most remain unexplored. Occasionally, underwater archaeology reveals stone structures, tools, or artifacts that challenge conventional timelines. These discoveries suggest that human settlements once existed, where there is now ocean floor. If these settlements were more advanced than expected, they might reflect earlier stages of civilization that disappeared when the ice melted. Climate research adds another dimension. During the last ice age, humans faced extreme conditions. When the climate warmed suddenly, ecosystems transformed. Food sources shifted, populations moved. These environmental pressures could have stimulated innovation. Groups with better strategies survived. Those strategies included cooperation, knowledge sharing, and resource planning, traits essential to civilization. If these traits developed under pressure, early forms of organized society might have emerged earlier than assumed. Some of the most surprising evidence for earlier civilization comes from ancient engineering. In several regions, people built structures requiring advanced understanding of stonework, leverage, and positioning. These structures appear older than recognized civilizations. They show attention to alignment with celestial events. They show coordination among large groups of workers. They show planning that extends beyond a single generation. These characteristics are not traits of simple hunter-gatherer bands. They resemble traits associated with early civilization, even if the communities themselves didn't resemble later urban centers. Myths also contribute to the conversation, not as literal history but as cultural memory. Many myths describe earlier ages of humanity. They talk about societies that rose and fell long before the present one. They describe builders who constructed great structures, or who possessed knowledge later generations lost. While myths are not evidence on their own, they reflect memories passed down for thousands of years. When archaeological discoveries align with the emotional patterns in those myths, it raises the possibility that the stories preserved fragments of real events. Ancient settlement layers often show abrupt changes. A site might be occupied for long periods, then suddenly abandoned. Another group might arrive with different tools, different techniques, or different symbols. These transitions reflect social change. They sometimes reflect environmental events. They sometimes reflect internal shifts within a community. These patterns mirror the rise and fall cycles described in myths. The physical evidence matches the narrative structure of cultural memory. Neither form confirms the other, but together they form a compelling picture. Early humans experienced cycles of development and collapse long before written history began. Another important aspect involves knowledge of agriculture. Some myths describe the sudden arrival of farming as a gift or revelation. Archaeological evidence shows that agriculture did not emerge in one location at one time. It appeared in multiple regions independently. This suggests experimentation and innovation occurring across wide areas. When groups discovered ways to cultivate plants, they shared knowledge with others. If agriculture emerged gradually through scattered experimentation, early forms of organized society may also have emerged gradually. The timeline becomes more flexible. Civilization becomes less of a single starting point and more of a long, uneven process. The concept of civilization itself complicates the discussion. When people imagine civilization, they think of cities, writing, and monumental architecture. But civilization can exist in forms that leave fewer traces. A society with stable leadership, trade networks, shared beliefs, and coordinated labour meets many definitions of civilization even without writing or large buildings. If early humans lived in such societies, the archaeological record might not always preserve their structures. Organic materials decay quickly. Settlements built from wood or earth disappear. Clothing, tools, and storage containers made from natural materials fade. All that remains are fragments, stone tools, pottery shards, hearths, and bones. These fragments don't necessarily reflect the full complexity of the society. Another complication is that human populations fluctuated dramatically in the distant past. Climate events reduced numbers. Local disasters wiped out groups. Migration scattered people. When a group with advanced knowledge disappeared, their culture might vanish except for memories preserved in the descendants of survivors. If those survivors joined another group, the knowledge might survive only partially. This pattern resembles the mythic stories of earlier ages lost to disaster. If something like civilization rose in certain regions before the oldest known cities, it might have disappeared before leaving obvious physical evidence. There are also cases where archaeological discoveries challenge established timelines. Stone structures appear in places where no complex culture was expected. Artifacts show skill far beyond what the timeline predicts. Genetic data suggests human populations were more diverse and widespread at earlier dates than assumed. These discoveries don't rewrite history by themselves, but they accumulate. They form a growing body of evidence suggesting the conventional timeline may be too narrow. In some regions, researchers found evidence of long-distance trade much earlier than expected. Trade requires social networks. Networks require communication and cooperation. These traits reflect organised society. If trade existed earlier than assumed, the societies participating in it were likely more complex than previously believed. Other discoveries involve tools associated with rituals or ceremony. These artifacts reflect belief systems that required cultural continuity. They required structured practices passed down across generations. This level of organisation resembles an early version of civilization even without cities. Some archaeological sites show signs of early agriculture far older than expected. These signs suggest experimentation with plant cultivation long before formal farming arose. If early humans were experimenting with cultivation, they were already thinking in ways that could eventually support settlement growth. Agriculture doesn't have to be fully developed to influence social structure. Even early attempts could create the conditions for more complex communities. What becomes clear is that the timeline of civilization is not a straight line. It is a pattern of rises and falls, experiments and collapses, innovations and losses. Human history stretches much farther back than the earlier cities. If earlier forms of civilization existed, they may have left subtle traces rather than monumental ruins. These traces appear in symbolic art, settlement patterns, unexpected engineering, long-distance connections, and stories carried in myth. Instead of imagining civilization as something that began suddenly in a few river valleys, it may be more accurate to see it as a process that started long before we thought. A process shaped by climate, migration, disaster, and innovation. A process that left faint but meaningful traces. A process that influenced the foundations of the later civilizations we recognize. Memories do not always behave the way people expect them to. Some disappear quickly, fading within days. Others linger for years. A few survive long enough to feel permanent. But then there are memories that slip below the surface, still present, still shaping behaviour, still influencing choices, yet carried in forms that don't look like memories anymore. They hide inside traditions, rituals, stories, habits, symbols, and beliefs. They remain even when the events that created them have vanished beyond recognition. Cultures often carry these hidden memories for thousands of years, long after the individuals who first experienced them are gone. When people talk about the possibility of remembering what has been forgotten, this is the pattern they are pointing toward. Knowledge disappears in one form and survives in another. Human history contains long stretches where entire ways of life collapsed. Settlements were abandoned, landscapes changed, populations moved, and knowledge systems dissolved. When those collapses happened, people lost more than buildings or tools. They lost explanations, they lost structure, they lost the reasons behind their traditions. But even when the explanations were gone, the actions often continued. A ritual that once had a clear purpose became mysterious, but remained important. A forbidden area remained avoided even after the danger was forgotten. A story that once described a real event became symbolic, but still carried emotional weight. These fragments raise an interesting idea. If people can preserve meaning without preserving details, then perhaps cultures have preserved memories of events far older than anyone realizes. Not precise memories, but impressions. Not literal accounts, but meaningful echoes. And if these echoes are scattered across global mythology, archaeology, ritual behavior, and symbolic art, then they may carry pieces of histories that vanished long before writing existed. This becomes more plausible when you consider how early humans processed the world. They didn't have scientific frameworks, but they observed carefully. They paid attention to patterns. They noticed small changes in weather, animal behavior, star movement, plant growth, and environmental cues. Their survival depended on those observations. When something extraordinary happened, something that disrupted all their expectations, it carved itself deep into cultural memory. Even after the literal cause was forgotten, the emotional imprint remained. That imprint shaped stories. Those stories shaped identity. And identity carried memory forward. In many traditions, people speak of earlier ages or earlier worlds. They talk about times before the present one. They describe transitions between these ages, often involving disasters. These transitions appear in cultures across continents. They rarely include dates or technical details, but they carry structure. A world existed. Something changed. The world after the change was different. This structure resembles the patterns found in archaeology and climate science. Landscapes shifted, coastlines flooded, glaciers retreated, populations moved, animals disappeared, knowledge was lost, new societies emerged. These real events happened repeatedly, and people lived through them. The possibility that myths remember those transitions is not far-fetched. Memory can also survive in forms people don't notice at first. When a culture emphasizes certain behaviors or values, those priorities may reflect experiences inherited from earlier generations. For example, some communities value cooperation above all else. Others emphasize caution around natural forces. Some focus on mobility. Others focus on stability. These values sometimes reflect environmental pressures faced long ago. A group that survived a catastrophe because they worked together might elevate cooperation into a cultural cornerstone. Over time, the original event is forgotten, but the value persists. The behavior becomes a memory trace. Another way forgotten memories survive is through symbolic objects. Early art often includes shapes, animals, or patterns repeated across generations. Some of these symbols appear in regions separated by continents and time. They may represent ideas shared by cultures that once had common ancestors. When those ancestors split and travelled, they carried the symbols with them. Later generations preserved the symbols even if they forgot the original meaning. Researchers sometimes identify these motifs as markers of ancient cultural memory. They might represent knowledge about migrations, events, or beliefs that persisted through symbolic form. Language also carries forgotten memory. Words shift over time, but roots stay. Some languages contain terms for tools, phenomena, or ideas that predate agriculture. These words survived through changing lifestyles. They suggest continuity stretching far earlier than documented history. When people use these words today, they unknowingly reference a world long gone. Their language preserves a faint memory of that world. Some cultural practices seem to reflect memories of landscapes or environments that no longer exist. A group might hold a ceremony involving water, despite living in a dry region for thousands of years. Another group might perform rituals involving snow even though their current environment rarely sees winter. These practices may reflect ancestral experiences. The rituals survive even when the environment changes. They become cultural memory embedded in behaviour rather than description. In other cases, memories survive through caution. Many myths include warnings about areas that should not be entered or actions that should not be repeated. These warnings often correspond to hazards that existed long ago. A story about a cursed valley might reflect an ancient landslide zone. A tale about forbidden cliffs might reflect areas prone to collapse. A myth about spirits living in caves might reflect toxic gases. The literal danger may no longer exist, but the caution remains. The memory survives as a warning. The idea of remembering what has been forgotten becomes even more interesting when you consider long-distance connections. Some myths describe places beyond the visible horizon. They talk about islands, mountains, or lands that no longer exist. In many cases, archaeology confirms that those regions were once above water or accessible. Rising sea levels removed them long before documented history began. But the stories remained. People remembered the land even after it disappeared. Their descendants inherited the memory without recognizing its origin. Memory also survives through story frameworks. Many myths follow similar arcs: a stable world, a disruption, a journey, a new beginning. This arc appears globally. It resembles the real patterns of early human migration. People moved after disasters. They left their homelands. They adapted. They rebuilt. The structure of the myth preserves the emotional experience even when the literal details changed. It reflects the rhythm of survival long before written history existed. In some traditions, the stories describe beings who lived before humans. The beings often behave in ways that resemble older cultures. They build, travel, teach, or shape land. These figures may represent memories of earlier groups that influenced later societies. The exaggeration masks the human origin, but the narrative structure preserves the interaction. The memory of earlier cultures survives in mythic form. There are also cases where myth preserves knowledge that archaeology later confirms. Stories of floods align with evidence of rising sea levels. Stories of fire align with evidence of volcanic eruptions. Stories of long winters align with evidence of climate shifts. These alignments show that myths preserve observations even when explanations disappear. The story distorts, but the memory remains. The possibility of remembering what has been forgotten expands further when you consider how deeply oral traditions can store information. Some communities maintain stories that reference events from thousands of years ago with surprising accuracy. The details are symbolic, but the descriptions of landscape, climate, or migration match scientific evidence. This shows how powerful oral memory can be. When a community values a story, it survives. It adapts, but it does not disappear. Memory also survives in physical structures. Stone alignments, carvings, or monuments often outlive the explanations behind them. People continue to honour the sites even when they no longer understand their purpose. The structure becomes a cultural anchor. The original meaning fades, but the practice remains. This is another form of memory. The monument itself carries the forgotten story. Sometimes memory persists even after a group merges with another. Cultural blending often causes older traditions to lose their original context, but fragments survive. A ritual, a song, a phrase, a pattern in clothing. These fragments may preserve memories of earlier societies absorbed into later ones. Over time, the origin becomes hidden, but the fragment remains. It becomes a faint memory encoded in culture. The possibility of remembering what has been forgotten also appears in genetic memory, not in a literal biological sense where experiences pass through DNA, but in the sense that population genetics preserves evidence of ancient migrations, intermixing and survival that myths echo emotionally. Genetics reveals where populations moved. Myths reveal how they experienced those movements. The science provides facts. The stories preserve feelings. Both forms contain memory. Another idea arises when you look at how communities respond to trauma. Modern studies show that traumatic experiences often shape behaviour for generations. Families pass down patterns unconsciously. Communities pass down caution. These patterns resemble mythic warnings. They may represent memories of real events whose details are forgotten, but whose emotional impact remains. Trauma becomes culture. Culture becomes memory. In many traditions, people describe having come from another place long ago. They say their ancestors travelled from a distant land. They describe hardships along the way. Archaeology often confirms migrations. The myth preserves the emotional narrative of relocation. Even when the literal path is forgotten, the sense of movement survives. The story becomes the memory. Some myths describe ancient knowledge that appears too advanced for the time. They talk about understanding stars, seasons, or building techniques before archaeology believes such knowledge existed. These stories may preserve memories from earlier cultures that were more advanced in certain areas. When those cultures collapsed, the knowledge was partially lost, but the memory of its existence survived in story. Occasionally, a myth contains anachronistic details. A group might describe tools they did not have, animals that no longer lived in their region, or landscapes that had changed long before the story was recorded. These details may reflect inherited memory from ancestors who lived in different conditions. The story preserved a memory of an earlier world. Sometimes, entire myth cycles revolve around the idea of forgetting and rediscovering. A group loses knowledge. A teacher figure arrives. Knowledge returns. This pattern resembles real cycles of collapse and recovery. The myth remembers the cycle even if the specific event is forgotten. When people consider whether something ancient can be remembered indirectly, another point becomes important. Memory does not always persist in linear form. It can become layered. A story might combine several events into one narrative. A ritual might reflect multiple ideas from different times. A symbol might blend meanings. The layers obscure clarity but preserve essence. Through these layers, distant memories survive without being recognized as memories. Some researchers suggest that when enough layers align across cultures, the underlying memory becomes clearer. If many stories from different places describe similar events, and archaeology confirms those events, then the stories may represent preserved cultural memory from a shared past. The details differ, but the structure remains. The possibility of remembering what has been forgotten is not mystical. It is cultural. It is psychological. It is anthropological. It reflects how humans process experience across generations. Knowledge becomes story. Story becomes tradition. Tradition becomes identity. Identity carries memory even when the original meaning disappears. The mind tends to drift after spending so much time wandering through ideas that stretch far beyond the familiar world. There's a strange quietness that appears when you pull away from distant histories and forgotten landscapes and begin returning to where you are now. Not because the journey ends, but because the pace shifts. The air feels a little different. The thoughts ease their grip. The world around you starts to come back into focus slowly, as if waking up from a long and steady conversation that travelled across thousands of years without breaking its rhythm. This kind of return doesn't have to be abrupt. It can move gently, giving your mind time to settle, letting the weight of everything you've just explored sink in without pulling you out of the calm that carried you here. There's something helpful about allowing the ideas to fade into the background naturally, instead of shutting them down the moment the discussion stops. When people explore the deep past, the stories in myth, the traces in archaeology, the memories carried in cultures, they can start to feel the distance between then and now shrinking. Those distant ages begin to feel less remote, not closer in time but closer in feeling, more connected, more familiar. When you start stepping back into the present, the mind brings pieces of those ideas with it. Not the literal details, but the sense of continuity, the sense that human experience has always carried layers, and those layers form the quiet threads that connect everything across thousands of generations. As your attention drifts away from the ancient patterns you've been following, the present moment begins reshaping itself around you again. The sounds in your room become clearer. The stillness becomes more noticeable. The weight of your body settles a little more into whatever you're resting on. Your breathing steadies without effort. There's something grounding about this part of the journey. All the vast distances you travelled in your mind start to fold themselves neatly, not disappearing, just becoming softer, less demanding. They take their place in the background, where they can continue shaping your thoughts without asking for your full attention. When you think about how far humanity reaches backward in time, you might expect the return to feel jarring. But it doesn't have to. It can feel like stepping out of a quiet room into an even quieter one. Your body knows exactly how to adjust. The present moment becomes something you ease into rather than snap back toward. The steady rhythm of your surroundings, the familiar temperature of the air, the softness of the light, everything gently welcomes you back. You don't have to rush. You don't have to brace yourself for anything. The pace naturally slows, and the mind follows. Even though the discussion moved across continents, across myths, across forgotten ages, the body stayed here the entire time. The return simply brings attention and awareness back to the place where your body has been resting. This shift creates a kind of balance. You've carried your imagination into the distant past, and now you let your senses bring you quietly home again. There's a steady comfort in that rhythm, the way the mind travels outward and then comes back inward, always finding its way back to the present without needing to force it. The ideas explored earlier, those long cycles, those preserved memories, those ancient traces, may still be circling gently in your thoughts. They don't have to go away. They can stay as a soft background presence. The return to the present doesn't erase them. It simply places them in a calmer part of your mind, a part where they can settle, where they can grow into reflections or questions or insights without pressing too strongly. You can let them remain there, resting alongside your own familiar thoughts. If your breathing hasn't slowed already, it tends to do so naturally as the mind shifts from exploration to settling. The body recognizes the change in pace. The exhale relaxes a little more. The inhale becomes quieter. There's no need to control anything. The body adjusts on its own, allowing the stillness to deepen. The thoughts continue to drift, but the edges soften. Each moment feels a little more grounded than the last. As the story comes back toward the present, it feels like walking into a room where you left everything exactly as it was. You didn't go anywhere physically, yet something feels slightly different now. Something inside has shifted. This happens when the mind explores long histories or forgotten worlds. The present feels clearer afterward, more defined, more spacious. Your awareness expands a little, simply because you've given it room to stretch. And now that it's returning to where you started, it carries that expanded sense with it. Maybe you can feel the shape of your surroundings a little more now, the softness of the space around you, the slight movements of air against your skin, the subtle sounds that exist even in quiet rooms. These details often fade into the background during long stretches of thought, but they come forward again as your awareness resettles. The room doesn't change, your relationship to it shifts. The ancient world slowly steps back, and the present moment moves gently to the front. There's something grounding about noticing simple things after spending time with ideas that stretch across millennia. The contrast is calming. It creates a sense of stability. The mind moves from big, wide thoughts back to small, familiar sensations. The shift helps clear mental space. It makes the present feel more immediate, more tangible, more restful, As you settle further into the moment, thoughts about the deep past can drift through your mind without dominating it. They can feel like distant shapes moving quietly at the edges of your awareness. They aren't sharp anymore. They don't demand your attention. They simply exist as part of the broader landscape of your thoughts. You can let them pass through gently without trying to hold on to them. You can let them drift the way clouds drift across a calm sky. There doesn't need to be a point of closure here. The ideas don't need to be wrapped up or summarized. The return to the present moment doesn't require a conclusion. You've followed a long, steady path through memory, myth, archaeology, and the echoes of earlier civilizations. The journey itself was the purpose. The return is just a continuation of that slow movement, shifting from curiosity toward rest. What you're noticing now is simply the natural rhythm of that shift. Your body easing further into stillness, your thoughts slowing their pace, the room settling into its quiet. If you're listening late at night, the stillness may feel even deeper. If you're listening during the day, it may feel like a soft pause woven into your afternoon. Either way, the return moves at its own pace, gently and gradually, giving you time to settle as much as you need. As the present moment becomes clearer, your mind still carries everything it gathered along the way, not in a heavy or overwhelming way, more like a soft imprint, a memory of having travelled through ideas that stretched far beyond your usual horizon. That memory can stay with you as lightly as you want. It can fade, or it can linger quietly. There's no need to hold on to it tightly. It remains available whenever your thoughts drift back toward it. You can let your attention rest here. No pressure to think. No need to reach for anything. The stillness of the moment supports you. The quiet around you is enough. The sense of ease in your breath is enough. The gentle settling of the mind is enough. Everything else can wait. You don't have to move or decide or shift out of this calm. The present moment doesn't require any effort. It simply allows you to be here. If your eyes feel heavy, you can let them be heavy. If your muscles feel loose, you can let them stay loose. If your mind feels spacious, you can keep that space open. Nothing needs to be adjusted. The journey is easing naturally into rest. The same way ancient stories drifted into new generations, your thoughts drift into stillness now. There's no line dividing exploration from calm. They merge slowly, one fading into the other. The present moment feels different after moving through something expansive. It feels a little wider, a little softer, a little more grounded. You may find that your breathing feels longer, or that the tension in your body has eased without you noticing. That's what happens when something guides you through a long, steady narrative. The body listens too, not just the mind. The quiet around you now carries a different texture. It has depth. It has weight. It doesn't feel empty. It feels like a place you can lean into. A place that welcomes the mind home after wandering far into the past. A place where all the thoughts settle out naturally, like dust drifting slowly to the ground.